Check out this relic. Both of them. Yeah, I wouldn't let him touch my bike.
For nearly 20 years, the people of Redstone had watched an old man grow older inside a junkyard, yet not one of them could remember the last time anyone had called him by his real name. To the town, he was simply the old biker, the homeless man who slept among abandoned cars and piles of rusted metal. Parents warned their children not to go near him. Teenagers turned him into a joke whenever they ran out of better entertainment. Even the shop owners who saw him twice a week buying nothing more than canned food and coffee barely looked him in the eye. They had all agreed on one thing without ever saying it aloud. Whatever life this man had once lived no longer mattered. Jack Sullivan never argued with any of them. He never explained where he had come from or why he had chosen to remain inside the junkyard long after everyone else had forgotten it existed. Every insult met the same quiet response. Every mocking smile received the same calm expression. It was as if the opinions of strangers had lost the power to hurt him years ago. That silence only encouraged people to invent stories. Some believed he had destroyed his own family. Others insisted he had wasted a fortune on alcohol. A few claimed he had once been dangerous before age finally broke him. None of them knew the truth because Jack never offered it. Only one thing inside the junkyard mattered to him. Hidden beneath a faded canvas cover rested an old Harley-Davidson that had not touched a highway in decades. Before beginning anything else each morning, Jack always uncovered the motorcycle for a few quiet moments, resting his weathered hand against the fuel tank as though greeting an old friend. He never tried to start the engine. He never spoke while standing there. Yet the look in his eyes carried more emotion than anything he had said to another human being in years. Whatever memories remained alive inside him were buried somewhere beneath that worn leather seat and faded black paint. The routine had remained unchanged for years, until 3 young men climbed through the broken fence, carrying smartphones instead of respect. Tyler Knox walked in first, grinning at the camera, already broadcasting live to thousands of followers. Humiliating strangers had become his fastest way to gain attention online, and the homeless old man living in the junkyard seemed like easy content. His friends, Mason and Drew, followed close behind, laughing before Jack had even turned around. "There he is," Tyler said loudly enough for both the live stream and the old man to hear. "The king of the junkyard!" His viewers responded immediately. Thousands of comments flooded the screen, mocking Jack's clothes, his gray beard, and the forgotten life they assumed he had lived. Tyler read the cruelest comments aloud, simply because they made his audience laugh harder. Mason wandered deeper into the junkyard, pointing his phone at the old bus where Jack slept, while Drew joked that even wild animals probably refused to live there. Jack remained silent. He continued folding the canvas over the motorcycle with slow, careful movements, refusing to acknowledge any of them. His refusal to react only frustrated Tyler, who stepped closer until the phone was almost touching Jack's face. "Tell everyone your name," Tyler challenged with a mocking smile. "Or did you forget that too?" Jack finally looked at him. His pale blue eyes revealed neither anger nor fear. They held only a quiet steadiness that made Tyler hesitate for the briefest moment before convincing himself the old man was simply too tired to fight back. "I asked you a question," Tyler pressed. Jack answered in the same calm voice he had used for years. "My name won't mean anything to you." The response drew even louder laughter. Tyler turned toward the motorcycle, shaking his head. Maybe this old wreck means more to him than people do. Mason walked over and reached for the canvas covering the Harley. Everything changed in a heartbeat. Jack crossed the distance before anyone realized he had moved. His hand closed firmly around Mason's wrist, stopping him before his fingers could touch the motorcycle. There was no violence in the old man's face. No shouting, no threat. Yet the strength in his grip shocked the young man into silence. Mason struggled instinctively, but the old biker never tightened his hold. He simply stood there, looking directly into the young man's eyes. "Don't touch it," Jack said quietly. Those 3 words carried a weight none of them expected. Tyler's smile faded. Even through the phone screen, viewers could sense something different about the old man. This was not the frightened homeless stranger they had expected to ridicule. For the first time, Jack looked less like a victim and more like someone who had spent an entire lifetime commanding respect. When Jack finally released Mason, the young man stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist in disbelief. Embarrassment quickly turned into anger. "You're crazy," Mason snapped. Jack ignored the accusation and carefully straightened the canvas over the motorcycle, treating it with a level of care that puzzled everyone watching. Tyler frowned. "What makes that piece of junk so special?" Jack rested one hand gently on the covered Harley before answering. "It belongs to a promise." The three young men exchanged confused looks before bursting into laughter once again. Tyler shook his head. "A promise. Look around you. That promise left you sleeping in a junkyard." For the first time that morning, something shifted in Jack's expression. A memory passed quietly behind his eyes, carrying decades of pain that no one there could possibly understand. He looked beyond the boys, beyond the broken fence, as though expecting someone who had taken far too long to arrive. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "No." His voice remained calm. "It brought me exactly where I was supposed to be." None of the boys understood what he meant. Neither did the thousands of people laughing through their phone screens. They ended the live stream believing they had spent the morning humiliating nothing more than a forgotten old man. Not one of them realized that the video they had just uploaded would spread across the country before sunset. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, men who had not worn their old leather vests in decades would watch Jack Sullivan's face appear on their screens, fall completely silent, and begin preparing for the ride that would change Redstone forever. Tyler uploaded the live stream before he and his friends had even driven out of the junkyard. By the time they reached the center of Redstone, thousands of people had already watched the video. Most of the comments mocked the old biker, exactly as Tyler had hoped. Some laughed at the worn leather vest that Jack refused to take off. Others joked that the motorcycle under the canvas was probably worth less than the phone used to record it. Every new notification made Tyler grin wider. To him, the old man was nothing more than another stranger whose dignity could be exchanged for clicks and applause. Jack, meanwhile, returned to his routine as though none of it had happened. He gathered discarded engine parts, sorted pieces of metal into neat piles, and quietly repaired a rusted toolbox that most people would have thrown away years earlier. There was no anger in his movements, no sign that the humiliation had left a scar. Yet anyone watching closely would have noticed that his eyes drifted toward the entrance of the junkyard more often than usual, as if he were waiting for someone who had not arrived. Late that afternoon, Emily Carter parked her car outside the junkyard and stepped through the broken gate with a camera hanging from her shoulder. She had spent the entire morning watching Tyler's livestream after it unexpectedly exploded across social media. At first, she intended to produce the same kind of story every local reporter chased whenever something went viral. A homeless veteran, a forgotten mechanic, a lonely old man abandoned by society. She had already imagined the headline before meeting him, but the moment she saw Jack standing beside the covered Harley, the story she had prepared no longer felt true. He did not look defeated. He did not carry himself like a man waiting for sympathy. There was something strangely disciplined about him, something that refused to fit the image the internet had already created. Even while sorting scrap metal, his movements were measured and deliberate, almost military in their precision. Every tool returned to the same place, every task finished before the next one began. It was the routine of someone who had spent a lifetime depending on discipline rather than luck. Emily introduced herself and explained that she worked for the local newspaper. Jack listened politely, never interrupting, but when she finally asked if he would agree to an interview, he simply shook his head. "I'm not the story you're looking for," he said. Emily smiled gently. "Maybe that's exactly why I came." Jack offered no reply. Instead, he continued working as though the conversation had already ended. Most reporters would have left. Emily didn't. She wandered slowly through the junkyard, pretending to examine old engines, while secretly studying the man who had become the center of so much ridicule in less than a day. The longer she stayed, the more details refused to match the image of a homeless drifter. Near the entrance stood dozens of license plates from different states across America: California, Texas, Nevada, Colorado, Tennessee, Florida, Montana, Wisconsin. They had been mounted carefully on a wooden wall instead of being sold for scrap. None of them looked random. Together they resembled memories collected over an entire lifetime. Inside the old bus, visible through the open doorway, Emily expected to find chaos. Instead, she found order. The bed was neatly made. Clothes had been folded with remarkable care. Every shelf was clean. A small wooden table held only a Bible, a coffee mug, and a faded photograph turned face down. She had interviewed enough homeless people to know this was unusual. People who had lost everything rarely preserved discipline. People who had chosen solitude often did. Her attention shifted toward the Harley again. The motorcycle fascinated her. It was old, but not neglected. Someone polished it regularly. The chrome still reflected light despite its age. The leather seat had been repaired by hand several times instead of replaced. Every scratch seemed preserved instead of hidden. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a memorial. Emily slowly walked around it, careful not to touch anything. Then she noticed something almost hidden beneath the edge of the canvas. A faded leather patch. Its embroidery had nearly disappeared, but one symbol remained unmistakable: a silver wolf. The design stirred an unexpected memory. Years earlier, while researching an article about motorcycle clubs, Emily had seen the same emblem in a black and white photograph taken sometime in the late 1980s. The caption had described it as one of the rarest patches ever worn by members of a legendary motorcycle brotherhood that had vanished decades ago. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked back toward Jack. The old man had stopped working. He wasn't watching her with suspicion. He was watching the patch. Almost instinctively, Emily reached toward it. Jack's voice stopped her before her fingers came close. "Please." It was not an order. It sounded almost like a request. "Leave that where it is." Emily slowly lowered her hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't trying to." "I know." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily asked the question that had begun growing in her mind. "Have we met before?" Jack smiled faintly. "No, but you've seen that symbol somewhere." Emily nodded. "I think I have." Jack looked at the old patch for a long moment before quietly covering it again beneath the canvas. "Some memories," he said softly, "should stay asleep." Emily wanted to ask another question. She wanted to know what the wolf meant. She wanted to know why a homeless old man owned a motorcycle that looked like history itself. She wanted to know why his eyes changed every time someone came close to it. Before she could speak again, the low rumble of a motorcycle echoed outside the junkyard. Both of them turned toward the gate. A lone rider rolled in slowly on a black Harley-Davidson. He wore no club colors, no identifying patches, only a plain black helmet. He stopped 10 feet away from Jack, shut off the engine, and removed his gloves without saying a single word. Emily expected the two men to greet each other. They didn't. The rider reached into his jacket, removed a small leather package no larger than his hand, and placed it carefully on an old workbench. Then, to Emily's astonishment, the stranger took one step back, lowered his head, and saluted Jack with absolute respect. No words, no explanation, only silence. Jack returned the gesture with the slightest nod. The rider turned around, climbed back onto his motorcycle, and disappeared without looking back once. Emily stood frozen. What was that? Jack looked down at the leather package resting on the workbench. For a long time he didn't move. When he finally opened it, a single weathered patch lay inside. the same silver wolf. This one carried 7 small stars stitched beneath it. Tucked underneath was a folded piece of paper. Jack unfolded it slowly. Only 2 words had been written across the center: 7 days. For the first time in decades, the old biker closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were no longer filled only with memory. They were filled with expectation. Far beyond Redstone, beyond Arizona, beyond everything the town believed it understood, 700 forgotten promises had just begun waking up. Emily spent the entire night staring at the same 2 words written on the small piece of paper she had copied into her notebook: 7 days. They lingered in her mind long after she had closed her laptop, and by dawn she had already made a decision that surprised even herself. She was no longer interested in writing another ordinary human interest story about a homeless man living in a forgotten junkyard. The internet had already decided who Jack Sullivan was. Millions of strangers had laughed at him without knowing anything about him. But the longer Emily thought about the quiet exchange she had witnessed the previous afternoon, the more convinced she became that the entire town had mistaken silence for weakness. She arrived at the newspaper office before sunrise and began searching every archive she could legally access. She started with local records, expecting to piece together the ordinary life of a mechanic who had fallen on hard times. Yet every search led to another dead end. Jack Sullivan's name appeared only in a handful of property documents from more than 30 years earlier, identifying him as the owner of Sullivan Auto Salvage. After that, it was as though his life had simply stopped existing. There were no interviews, no court records, no business disputes, no bankruptcy filings, and no obituary for anyone connected closely enough to explain why a successful business had become an abandoned junkyard. The silence surrounding his past felt unnatural, almost deliberate, as though someone had carefully gathered every page of his history and removed it from public view. Emily refused to believe a man could disappear so completely without leaving behind a single meaningful trace. She widened her search beyond Arizona and began digging through decades of archived newspapers, motorcycle magazines, charity ride reports, and photographs from cross-country rallies. Hundreds of names appeared on her screen, but none belonged to Jack Sullivan. Just as frustration began replacing curiosity, an old newspaper scan caught her attention. It showed a massive motorcycle charity event from the late 1980s, with rows of riders standing shoulder to shoulder in matching leather vests. The image itself was faded, but one small detail immediately pulled her closer to the screen. On the back of one rider's vest was the unmistakable image of a silver wolf. Emily enlarged the photograph until the pixels blurred together. Even through the poor quality, she recognized the design instantly. It was identical to the worn leather patch hidden beneath the canvas covering Jack's motorcycle. The same wolf. The same proud posture. The same raised head staring toward the horizon. Her pulse quickened as she searched the article accompanying the photograph, but time had destroyed much of the printed text. Only scattered sentences remained readable. They mentioned the rapidly growing motorcycle brotherhood that had spread across several states, and referred briefly to its founder, a man known only by the nickname Iron Wolf. Everything after that point had been torn away or faded beyond recognition. Emily searched the nickname over and over again, using every database available to her. Nothing appeared. She searched the silver wolf emblem, the motorcycle brotherhood, and every variation she could imagine, yet every search returned the same empty result. It felt impossible. Organizations of that size did not simply vanish from history, and men important enough to found them did not disappear without leaving behind photographs, interviews, or official records. For the first time in her career, Emily found herself confronting a mystery that technology could not solve. The following afternoon, she returned to the junkyard, carrying far more questions than answers. Jack was working beneath the hood of an old pickup truck, his sleeves rolled above his wrists, as he tightened a worn engine part with steady, practiced hands. He noticed her almost immediately, but continued working without surprise, as though he had expected her to come back. Emily stopped beside him and offered a small smile. "I spent all night looking for your past." Jack set the wrench down and wiped the grease from his hands before looking at her. There was no irritation in his face, only the quiet patience of someone who had lived long enough to recognize curiosity when he saw it. "And what did you find?" he asked. "Almost nothing," Emily admitted. "It's like someone erased your life." Jack gave a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. No one erased it. People simply stopped looking. His answer lingered between them, leaving Emily with the strange feeling that he had accepted being forgotten long before anyone else had forgotten him. She glanced toward the covered Harley once more before speaking again. "I found the silver wolf." Jack's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It wasn't fear that crossed his face, nor anger. It was recognition, followed by a sadness so old that it seemed to belong to another lifetime. "You've seen it before," he said quietly. "I found an old photograph from a charity ride decades ago. There were hundreds of bikers, and one of them wore the same emblem. The article mentioned someone called Iron Wolf." For the first time since they had met, Jack remained completely still. His eyes drifted toward the motorcycle beneath the canvas, and Emily realized she had unknowingly stepped onto ground he had protected for many years. After a long silence, Jack walked slowly toward the Harley and rested his hand on the covered fuel tank. The gesture was so natural that it almost resembled greeting an old friend. "It wasn't just a patch," he said softly. "It was a promise." Emily followed him without taking her eyes off the motorcycle. "A promise to who?" Jack lowered his head, and when he answered, his voice carried the quiet weight of memories he had never shared with anyone in Redstone. "To my brothers." Emily looked at him in confusion. What happened to them? Jack closed his eyes for only a moment before opening them again. They kept writing. "And you?" A faint smile appeared on his face, but it was the kind of smile born from regret rather than happiness. "I stayed behind." Emily wanted to ask why. She wanted to know what had happened 30 years earlier that could make a man abandon an entire life and willingly disappear inside a forgotten junkyard. Before the question could leave her lips, the distant rumble of several motorcycle engines drifted across the town. The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading into silence, yet Jack instinctively lifted his head toward the road beyond the broken gate. He checked the old watch strapped around his wrist, then quietly whispered words Emily was never meant to hear. 6 more days. Emily felt a chill she couldn't explain. She remembered the note inside the leather package, and suddenly realized that the mysterious countdown had already begun. She still had no idea who was coming, why they were coming, or what promise Jack had guarded for so many years. But deep inside, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The entire town had laughed at the wrong man. Emily drove away from the junkyard with far more questions than she had answers. But this time, she wasn't chasing a headline. She was chasing the truth. Every instinct she had developed during years as a reporter told her that Jack Sullivan had spent decades hiding from something much bigger than poverty. Men did not willingly erase themselves from history, unless the past demanded a sacrifice too painful to escape. Yet the more she thought about the old biker, the more one question refused to leave her mind. If Jack had truly wanted to disappear, why had he remained in the same junkyard for almost 30 years? Why stay in the one place where anyone looking hard enough could eventually find him? The answer came unexpectedly the following morning. Emily was reviewing old satellite photographs of Redstone when she noticed something that had never appeared in any recent property survey. Buried beneath decades-old construction plans was the original blueprint for Sullivan Auto Salvage. The junkyard had not always been a collection of abandoned vehicles. 30 years earlier, it had been a thriving repair business with 3 service garages, a parts warehouse, and a large concrete building near the center of the property. According to the blueprint, that building contained a reinforced underground storage room. Emily immediately compared the drawing with modern aerial images, only to discover that the building no longer existed. At some point, it had burned to the ground, leaving nothing but an empty patch of dirt that nobody had questioned for years. Her curiosity grew stronger. When she returned to the junkyard that afternoon, Jack was sitting beside the covered Harley, quietly polishing one of its chrome exhaust pipes with an old cloth. He looked up as she approached and smiled faintly, almost amused by how quickly she had returned. "You found something," he said. Emily stopped beside him, holding several printed copies of the old blueprint. "I found out this place used to be much bigger." Jack glanced at the papers without reaching for them. There was another building. There were several. Emily unfolded the blueprint and pointed toward the center of the property. This one disappeared. Jack studied the faded drawing for a few seconds before looking away. It burned. Accident. His silence answered before his voice did. No. Emily lowered the papers. Then why hasn't anyone ever mentioned it? Jack folded the polishing cloth carefully across his knee before speaking. Because the people who remembered either left or died. The words settled heavily between them. Emily sensed she was standing closer to the truth than ever before. Yet every answer Jack gave seemed to uncover an even larger mystery waiting underneath. She wanted to ask what had happened inside that missing building, but something in his face warned her that the question would reopen wounds he had spent decades trying to carry in silence. Instead, she looked toward the empty space where the structure had once stood. "Is that why you stayed?" Jack followed her gaze. "For a long time, I thought I was staying because I couldn't leave." He paused, his eyes fixed on the same patch of ground. "Eventually, I realized I was staying because someone had to remember." Emily looked back at him. "Remember what?" Jack's expression softened with the quiet sadness she had begun recognizing whenever the conversation drifted toward the past. "The men who never came home." Before Emily could ask another question, the sound of tires crunching over gravel interrupted them. A pickup truck pulled slowly through the broken gate before stopping a short distance away. An elderly man climbed out, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His white beard was neatly trimmed, and despite the years showing clearly on his face, his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had once stood much taller than age allowed him now. The stranger spotted Jack and froze. For several seconds, neither man moved. Emily watched in silence as emotions neither of them tried to hide passed across their faces. Surprise gave way to disbelief. Disbelief slowly became recognition. The older visitor was the first to speak. "I wasn't sure it was really you." Jack rose slowly to his feet. "I wasn't sure anyone still would." The two men walked toward each other without another word. Emily expected a handshake. Instead, they embraced like brothers who had survived different wars, but carried the same scars. Neither of them spoke during those first few moments, because words would have been too small for everything that stood between them. When they finally stepped apart, the visitor smiled through eyes already glistening with emotion. "You've gotten old, Jack." Jack laughed quietly. "So have you, Walter." Emily watched the exchange in stunned silence. This was the first person she had ever seen treat Jack Sullivan as someone worthy of admiration rather than pity. Walter turned toward her politely. "I suppose you're wondering who I am." Emily nodded. "My name is Walter Hayes." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "I used to ride beside Jack." The sentence sounded simple, yet the weight behind it was unmistakable. Emily immediately recognized the past tense. "Used to?" she asked. Walter smiled sadly. "Once a biker, always a biker." Jack looked at his old friend and quietly shook his head. "You weren't supposed to come." Walter reached inside his jacket and removed a folded envelope. "I know." He handed it to Jack without another word. Jack stared at the familiar handwriting on the front before slowly opening it. Inside was a short letter and another silver wolf patch nearly identical to the one delivered the day before. Walter watched him carefully. "The others have all received theirs." Jack looked up sharply. Already, Walter nodded. No one asked questions. Jack remained silent. No one hesitated either. Emily's heart began beating faster. The others, she asked. Walter turned toward her. The brothers who made a promise. Jack closed the envelope and slipped it carefully inside his leather vest. His eyes drifted toward the highway beyond the junkyard, as though he could already hear something still too distant for everyone else. Walter followed his gaze before speaking one final sentence. They're coming from everywhere now. Emily frowned. How many are coming? Walter smiled. I stopped counting after 300. He paused, his voice lowering almost to a whisper. And that was yesterday. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected a few old friends, perhaps a dozen former bikers, maybe even 50. But if Walter was telling the truth, hundreds of riders had already begun crossing the country because of one old man the entire town believed had been forgotten. At that very moment, hundreds of miles away, motorcycles rolled out of garages that had remained closed for years. Leather vests were lifted from dusty shelves. Silver wolf patches were sewn back onto weathered jackets. Men whose hair had turned gray and whose hands had grown unsteady started engines they thought they would never ride again. None of them were traveling for a reunion. None of them were traveling for nostalgia. They were answering a promise that had waited 30 years to be fulfilled. And Redstone had less than 6 days before it discovered exactly who Jack Sullivan really was. Walter remained in the junkyard until dusk, but neither he nor Jack spoke much after Emily learned that hundreds of riders had already begun their journey. The silence between the two old men never felt awkward. It resembled the quiet shared by soldiers who no longer needed words to remember the battles they had survived together. Emily sat nearby, pretending to organize her notes. Yet, every few minutes she caught herself looking toward them, hoping another piece of the mystery would reveal itself. Instead, she witnessed something even stranger. Walter never once asked Jack how he had lived all these years, and Jack never asked where Walter had been. It was as though those answers had become irrelevant the moment they saw each other again. When Walter finally stood to leave, he embraced Jack one last time, before placing a firm hand on his shoulder. They're expecting to see Iron Wolf again, he said quietly. Jack lowered his eyes. There is no Iron Wolf anymore. Walter's expression hardened, with the disappointment only an old friend could show without causing offense. That's what you've been telling yourself for 30 years, he replied. The rest of us never believed it. Jack offered no answer. Walter climbed back into his pickup and drove away without looking back, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Emily waited until the truck disappeared beyond the highway before turning toward Jack. She had spent 2 days gathering fragments of a story that refused to fit together, and for the first time, she realized the truth might be hidden not in what Jack said, but in everything he carefully avoided saying. You never denied it, she said softly. Jack looked at her. Denied what? That they called you Iron Wolf. A faint smile crossed his weathered face before fading almost immediately. Names don't matter. They matter if hundreds of people are crossing the country because of one. Jack slowly covered the Harley once more, smoothing the canvas with the same care he always had. They're not coming because of me. Emily frowned. Then why are they coming? Jack remained silent for so long that she thought the conversation had ended. Finally, he rested one hand on the motorcycle and spoke with a voice so calm that it almost sounded detached from the memory itself. They're coming because one promise was never finished. Emily sensed the sorrow behind those words, but before she could ask another question, Jack quietly walked away toward the old bus. The conversation was over. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what Walter had said. They're expecting to see Iron Wolf again. Who was Iron Wolf? A nickname alone couldn't inspire hundreds of aging bikers to leave their homes at the same time. There had to be something much larger behind it. The next morning, Emily drove nearly 80 miles to Phoenix after remembering an old motorcycle repair shop that had operated there for decades. The owner, Frank Dawson, was well into his 70s and had earned a reputation for remembering nearly every major motorcycle club that had ever ridden through Arizona. Frank looked up from his workbench as Emily entered the shop carrying a printed copy of the Silver Wolf patch. He barely glanced at it before his face lost all color. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Emily immediately noticed the change in his voice. "You recognize it?" Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he locked the front door, turned the sign to closed, and lowered the blinds covering the windows. Only then did he return to the counter, still staring at the patch as though it belonged to another lifetime. "I haven't seen this symbol in almost 30 years. Emily leaned forward. "What was it?" Frank let out a slow breath. "It wasn't a motorcycle club." Emily blinked. "I've heard someone else say that." Frank nodded, because calling them a club never did them justice. He carefully picked up the paper. They were brothers. Emily's heartbeat quickened. Who was Iron Wolf? For several seconds, Frank simply looked at her silently, deciding how much he should reveal. Finally, he spoke. "I never knew his real name." Emily felt her hope slipping away. Nobody did. Frank shook his head. We all knew him as Iron Wolf. That was enough. He walked toward an old filing cabinet standing in the corner of the shop and unlocked the bottom drawer. After searching through dozens of dusty folders, he removed a yellowed magazine wrapped carefully inside a plastic sleeve. The cover showed hundreds of motorcycles stretching across a desert highway. Across the top was the headline, "America's Greatest Charity Ride." Frank opened the magazine to the center pages and carefully laid it on the counter. Emily immediately recognized the Silver Wolf patches. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The article described a brotherhood famous for organizing charity rides, delivering emergency supplies after natural disasters, and raising millions of dollars for children's hospitals and veterans' families. Wherever tragedy struck, riders wearing the Silver Wolf arrived long before television cameras or politicians. Emily turned page after page in disbelief. Everything she read contradicted the image Redstone had created of Jack Sullivan. Then she reached the final page. The article ended abruptly. Below the last paragraph, someone had handwritten 3 words in faded blue ink. "Never printed again." Emily looked up. What happened? Frank slowly closed the magazine. There was one ride his voice became almost a whisper that changed everything. Emily held her breath. What happened on that ride? Frank stared toward the shop window without really seeing it. The wrong men were waiting for them. He fell silent again, his eyes clouded by memories he had spent decades trying to forget. Emily realized she was finally standing at the edge of the truth. She just didn't know whether she was ready to hear it. Emily remained in Frank Dawson's workshop long after their conversation should have ended. The elderly mechanic seemed lost in thoughts he had locked away for decades, absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the old magazine with his fingertips. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It carried the weight of memories that neither ink nor photographs had ever been able to preserve. After several minutes, Frank reached beneath the counter and lifted out a weathered cardboard box. Its corners had softened with age, and a thin layer of dust covered the lid, suggesting it had not been opened in years. He hesitated before setting it down in front of Emily. "I promised myself I'd never look through these again," he admitted, "but maybe they're not mine to keep anymore." Inside the box were dozens of faded photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, and event badges collected over many years. Emily carefully picked up the first photograph. It showed a long procession of motorcycles escorting the funeral of a soldier whose family stood quietly beside the road. Another picture captured riders unloading blankets and food after a wildfire had destroyed an entire neighborhood. There were images of blood donation drives, children's hospitals' charity auctions, and veterans smiling beside men wearing the Silver Wolf emblem. None of the photographs resembled the image most people associated with motorcycle organizations. They did all this, Emily asked, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. Frank nodded slowly. They believed that wearing a patch meant carrying responsibility. Jack used to tell every new rider that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned every single day. Emily paused as she turned over another photograph. On the back, someone had written a short sentence in blue ink. "Leave every town better than you found it." The handwriting looked firm and confident. Who wrote this? Frank smiled faintly. Jack. Emily read the sentence again, trying to reconcile those words with the lonely old man living inside an abandoned junkyard. The contrast felt almost impossible. The internet had spent the previous day mocking him as a forgotten drifter, while the evidence in front of her painted the portrait of someone who had inspired thousands of people to dedicate their lives to serving others. She continued sorting through the contents of the box until a folded newspaper caught her attention. The headline was partially faded, but one phrase remained perfectly readable: "Largest charity ride in state history." Beneath the title stood a younger Jack Sullivan, surrounded by hundreds of bikers. He looked nothing like the quiet man Emily had come to know over the past few days. His shoulders were straight, his smile carried unmistakable confidence, and the riders around him watched him with admiration rather than obligation. Even through the old photograph, it was obvious that he wasn't simply leading the group. He was the man they trusted without question. Emily looked up from the newspaper. What changed, Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, buying himself a few extra seconds before confronting a memory he had never truly escaped. Jack never wanted to be famous, he said at last. He believed leadership meant standing in front when danger came, and stepping aside when praise arrived. That's why people followed him. They knew he'd never ask them to face a risk he wouldn't face first. Emily quietly folded the newspaper. If everyone respected him that much, why did everything fall apart? Frank leaned back in his chair and released a weary sigh. Because trust is the strongest thing people can build, and betrayal is the fastest way to destroy it. Those words hung heavily in the room. Emily waited. She had learned that interrupting Frank only pushed him further into silence. After a long pause, he finally continued. The Brotherhood received an invitation to a private gathering in northern Arizona. It wasn't unusual. Every few years, senior members met away from the public to discuss future charity projects and decide where the next national ride would take place. Only a small circle knew the exact location, and every man there trusted the others with his life. Frank's gaze drifted toward the old photographs spread across the counter. But someone sold that trust. Emily felt her chest tighten. To whom I never found out. What happened after that? Frank slowly shook his head. I wasn't there. My wife had gone into labor the night before, so I stayed home. For years, I thanked God for that decision, but every time I looked at these pictures, I wondered whether surviving had really been the easier burden. Emily remained silent. She sensed that guilt had followed Frank almost as faithfully as it had followed Jack. The news reached us before sunrise, Frank continued. Nobody understood exactly what had happened. We only knew that the meeting had ended in tragedy. Some men never returned. Others came back carrying wounds they refused to explain. They buried their brothers, attended the funerals, and then disappeared, one after another. What about Jack? Frank cast his eyes briefly. He vanished before anyone could stop him. Emily frowned. He didn't attend the funerals. Frank nodded. He attended every single one. His voice softened. I've never forgotten that week. Jack stood beside every family. He spoke to every widow. He hugged every child who had just lost a father. He never cried where anyone could see him, but by the last funeral, he looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 7 days. Emily pictured the old biker sitting quietly beside his Harley, protecting it as though it contained his last connection to another world. For the first time, she began to understand that the motorcycle wasn't simply a machine. It had survived the same tragedy that had destroyed the life of the man who owned it. "What happened after the funerals?" she asked. Frank stared toward the shop door, his expression growing distant. Jack called the remaining senior members together one final time. No reporters were invited. No photographs were taken. Nobody outside that room ever learned exactly what was said. But someone knows. Frank gave a slow nod. The men who were there. Emily leaned forward. "And they're the ones coming to Redstone." Frank looked directly into her eyes. "They're not coming because Jack is old." He paused briefly. "They're not coming because they pity him either." Emily waited for the rest. "They're coming because 30 years ago, they gave their leader a promise, and every one of them has carried the shame of not fulfilling it." Emily felt a strange mixture of anticipation and sorrow settle over her. Whatever had happened on that final ride had bound those men together far more tightly than any club or organization ever could. Time had scattered them across the country, but it had never broken the promise they had made. As she thanked Frank and walked back toward her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that Redstone was standing on the edge of something extraordinary. The people of the town still believed Jack Sullivan was nothing more than an aging homeless man whose life had quietly faded into obscurity. They had no idea that somewhere beyond the state line, engines were already beginning to roar to life, not out of nostalgia, but out of loyalty to a man whose greatest chapter had never truly ended. Emily left Phoenix just before sunset, but instead of driving directly back to the newspaper office, she headed straight for Redstone. The conversation with Frank Dawson had changed more than her understanding of Jack Sullivan. It had changed the way she viewed everyone in town. For years, they had walked past the old biker without seeing him, convinced they understood his entire life simply because they could see where he slept. They never wondered what a man had sacrificed before ending up alone in a forgotten junkyard. They judged the final chapter without ever reading the pages that came before it. By the time Emily reached the edge of town, something felt different. Redstone had always been quiet. Most afternoons passed with little more than pickup trucks rolling through the main street and familiar faces drifting in and out of the grocery store. Today, however, unfamiliar motorcycles had begun appearing in places where they had never been seen before. A black Road King stood outside the diner. Another Harley was parked beside the old hardware store. Across the street, two riders sat silently on a bench, drinking coffee without speaking to anyone. They wore ordinary leather jackets with no obvious club insignia, yet Emily immediately noticed the small silver wolf stitched near the shoulder blade of each vest. The patch was subtle enough that almost no one else paid attention to it. She knew exactly what it meant. Emily parked across the street and watched the two riders through her windshield. Both men appeared to be in their late 60s. One walked with a slight limp, while the other leaned carefully against a cane whenever he stood. They looked nothing like the intimidating bikers portrayed in movies. They looked like grandfathers enjoying an afternoon together. Yet every few minutes, their eyes drifted toward the highway leading to the junkyard. They weren't sightseeing. They were waiting. Emily crossed the street and introduced herself. The two men exchanged a brief glance before returning polite smiles. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I'm a reporter here in Redstone." The taller man nodded. "We figured you might be." His calm response caught her off guard. "You know who I am?" He chuckled softly. Jack always said reporters could smell a mystery from miles away. Emily smiled, despite herself. "You know Jack well." The man extended his hand. "My name's Daniel Brooks." His companion did the same. "Sam Turner." Emily immediately noticed both handshakes. Their palms were rough, scarred, and marked by decades of physical work. These were not wealthy executives pretending to be bikers on weekends. They were men who had spent their lives earning every mile they had traveled. "Were you part of Iron Brotherhood?" Emily asked carefully. Neither man answered immediately. Instead, Daniel reached into his wallet and removed an old photograph that had clearly been carried for many years. The edges had become soft with age, but the image remained surprisingly clear. It showed 6 young riders standing beside a line of motorcycles. Jack was among them. Unlike every other photograph Emily had seen, this one captured him laughing openly. His arm rested across the shoulders of another rider, and the happiness on his face looked effortless. Daniel noticed Emily studying the photograph. "That was taken the day I joined." Emily looked at him. "Jack recruited you." Daniel laughed. "He saved me." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel folded the photograph carefully before returning it to his wallet. "I was 23, angry at the world. My father had died, my marriage had fallen apart, and I spent every night looking for a fight. One evening, I picked the wrong bar." Sam smiled quietly. Jack happened to be there. Daniel nodded. "I thought he was just another biker." "What happened?" "He could have broken every bone in my body." Emily blinked. "But he didn't." Daniel shook his head. "He bought me dinner." Emily couldn't hide her surprise. "Dinner?" "He sat across from me for 3 hours without judging me once. Before we left, he handed me a business card and told me something I've never forgotten." Daniel's voice softened. He said, "You can spend your life proving how tough you are, or you can spend it becoming the kind of man your father would have been proud to call his son." Emily felt a lump forming in her throat. "What did you do?" Daniel smiled. "I showed up at his garage the next morning." Sam laughed quietly. So did half the people standing in those old photographs. Emily suddenly understood something she had missed until now. Jack had never built a motorcycle organization. He had built a family. Before she could ask another question, another motorcycle rolled slowly into the parking lot, then another. Within the next 10 minutes, 6 more Harleys arrived from different directions. None of the riders greeted each other with loud voices or dramatic gestures. They simply nodded with quiet familiarity before taking seats outside the diner, as though this gathering had been planned for years. Emily noticed that almost every one of them carried gray hair beneath their helmets. Some walked with stiff knees. Others wore hearing aids. One man carefully helped another remove his riding gloves because arthritis had twisted his fingers. Age had slowed their bodies. It had not weakened their loyalty. Daniel watched them arrive, one after another, before speaking almost to himself. "We've buried a lot of brothers since the last ride." Sam lowered his eyes. "Too many." Emily looked around at the growing group. "How many of you are coming?" Daniel smiled. "We don't know." "You don't?" He shook his head. The invitation only said one thing. Emily already knew the answer before he spoke it. "If you still remember your promise, come home." Silence settled over the table. No one needed to explain who had written those words. No one needed to ask whether they would obey them. Each motorcycle parked outside the diner represented a man who had carried that promise through marriages, careers, illnesses, and retirement. 30 years had changed their faces beyond recognition. Yes, not one of them had forgotten where they were supposed to be when the time finally came. As Emily watched the riders quietly sharing coffee instead of stories, she realized something remarkable. None of them spoke about the past. They didn't boast about the miles they had traveled or the sacrifices they had made to reach Redstone. It was as though every conversation had been postponed until one person arrived: Jack. Without him, the reunion could not truly begin. And somewhere inside the junkyard, completely unaware of how many old brothers had already reached town, Jack Sullivan continued living as though he were still the loneliest man in Arizona. The news spread through Redstone long before anyone understood its meaning. Residents began noticing unfamiliar motorcycles parked outside restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores, and small motels. At first, no one paid much attention. Arizona was no stranger to traveling riders, especially during the warmer months. But by the second day, even the people who rarely noticed anything unusual started asking the same question. Why are there so many bikers in town? Nobody had an answer. The visitors caused no trouble. They weren't racing through the streets or gathering in loud groups. They smiled politely, thanked waitresses for their meals, tipped generously, and disappeared before anyone had the chance to ask where they had come from. If anything, they were the most respectful travelers Redstone had hosted in years. Only Emily knew they hadn't arrived by coincidence. She spent the afternoon moving between the motel on the edge of town and the small diner near the highway, quietly introducing herself to the newcomers. Every conversation followed a strangely similar pattern. The riders willingly spoke about their families, their grandchildren, and the long journeys they had made across the country. Yet the moment she mentioned Jack Sullivan, every face softened in exactly the same way. None of them called him a homeless man. None of them referred to him as an old mechanic. To every rider she met, he was simply Jack. More importantly, every one of them spoke his name with unmistakable respect. Late that afternoon, Emily met another rider who had just arrived from Montana after nearly 2 days on the road. His name was Richard Collins, a retired firefighter whose broad shoulders and weathered hands suggested he had spent most of his life running toward danger while others ran away from it. When Emily asked how long he had known, Jack Richard smiled, as though someone had mentioned a member of his own family. 40 years, he replied. You've stayed in touch all that time? Richard slowly shook his head. I haven't spoken to him in almost 30 years. Emily stared at him in confusion. Then why drive all this way? Richard looked through the diner window toward the distant highway before answering. Because not every promise needs to be repeated. His words lingered in Emily's mind long after the conversation ended. As the afternoon faded into evening, more motorcycles continued rolling into town. Some riders arrived alone, others traveled in pairs. They greeted one another with brief embraces, exchanged quiet smiles, and immediately asked the same question. Has Jack seen everyone yet? The answer was always the same. Not yet. Emily found it remarkable that no one seemed impatient. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and thousands of miles of open highway, yet none of them hurried toward the junkyard. It was almost as though an invisible agreement bound them all together. They would wait. Only when the right moment arrived would they stand before the man they had come to see. Meanwhile, life inside the junkyard continued as if nothing beyond its broken fence had changed. Jack spent the morning repairing an old truck transmission before organizing shelves filled with salvaged tools. Anyone passing by would have assumed he knew nothing about the growing number of bikers entering Redstone. Emily wasn't convinced. She parked outside the gate shortly before sunset and found him sitting beside the covered Harley, cleaning a pair of worn leather gloves with the same patience he seemed to bring to every task. You already know they're here, she said. Jack looked up and smiled faintly. I know. Emily walked closer. You haven't gone to meet them. They didn't come for greetings. They came because of you. Jack lowered his eyes toward the gloves resting in his hands. They came because of Michael. Emily heard the unfamiliar name and immediately stopped walking. Michael Jack remained silent for a moment before carefully folding the gloves across his knee. Michael Reed. The name escaped him almost like a prayer. He was my best friend. Emily sensed the emotion in his voice immediately. Until that moment, Jack had always spoken about the past with careful distance, revealing only fragments while protecting the memories underneath. This time was different. Saying Michael's name alone seemed enough to pull him back into a part of his life he had tried desperately to leave behind. Was he part of the Brotherhood? She asked gently. Jack nodded. He was there before anyone else. Emily sat quietly on an old wooden crate nearby, instinctively realizing she had reached the edge of a story Jack had never intended to tell. He believed in the Brotherhood before it even had a name. Jack continued. When there were only 6 of us riding together on weekends, Michael kept saying we could become something bigger than ourselves. I thought he was dreaming. A faint smile crossed Jack's face. He usually dreamed bigger than the rest of us. What happened to him? The smile disappeared. For several long seconds, Jack didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the Harley beneath the canvas, as though searching for strength inside a memory only he could see. Finally, he spoke. I buried him. Emily's heart tightened. I'm sorry. Jack slowly shook his head. No. His voice became quieter. You shouldn't apologize. She looked at him, waiting. I should. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Jack closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. Because he died protecting me. The words struck Emily harder than she expected. Everything suddenly began falling into place. The sorrow, the loneliness, the abandoned junkyard, the untouched Harley, the promise. 30 years earlier, something had happened that Jack had never forgiven himself for. Before Emily could ask another question, the sound of another motorcycle echoed outside the junkyard. Both of them turned toward the gate as a rider slowly rolled to a stop before shutting off the engine. Unlike the others, this man didn't remove his helmet immediately. He remained seated for several seconds, staring silently at Jack. Then he climbed off the motorcycle, walked forward without saying a word, and placed a small metal object into Jack's trembling hand. It was an old pocket watch. The cracked glass across its face had long since stopped reflecting time, but engraved inside the cover were 6 simple words. Finish the ride for Michael. Jack's hand began to tremble. For the first time since Emily had met him, tears gathered silently in his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. He simply closed the watch, holding it against his chest, as though he had just been reunited with someone he thought he had lost forever. Emily realized she wasn't witnessing the beginning of a reunion. She was witnessing the return of a promise that had been waiting 3 decades for its final chapter. Emily left the junkyard with the image of Jack Sullivan holding Michael Reed's pocket watch burned into her memory. She had seen grief before in courtrooms, hospital waiting rooms, and quiet houses where families spoke in broken voices after losing someone they loved. But Jack's grief was different. It did not rise loudly. It did not ask anyone to witness it. It sat inside him, with the weight of something carried for so long that it had become part of his body, part of his breath, part of the silence people in Redstone had mistaken for emptiness. Only now did Emily understand that the old biker had not been living among scrap metal because he had nowhere else to go. He had stayed because the place held the last unfinished piece of a life he believed he had no right to reclaim. That night, while Redstone slept under the false comfort of ordinary routines, Emily sat alone in her apartment with Frank Dawson's photographs spread across her table and the writer's testimonies filling the pages of her notebook. Every name led back to Jack. Every story carried the same pattern. A man lost his way, and Jack found him before the world finished throwing him away. A family needed help, and Jack appeared with motorcycles, tools, money, and men willing to work until their hands bled. A veteran died with no relatives beside him, and Jack made sure the road to the cemetery was lined with engines and respect. The more Emily read, the more shame settled inside her because she had almost written the same story everyone else wanted a pity piece about a homeless man. She had nearly helped the town bury him beneath one more careless label. Near midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel Brooks. The text contained only an address and a time for breakfast the next morning, but the final sentence made her sit straighter. He wrote that if she truly wanted to understand why the brothers were coming back, she needed to hear Michael's name from the men who had loved him. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing that Jack's story could not be told through public records, because the most important parts of his life had been preserved in the hearts of men who had spent 30 years carrying guilt, gratitude, and a promise they had never been able to fulfill. By 7 the next morning, the diner near the highway had changed into something Redstone had never seen before. Motorcycles filled the spaces outside, But the men inside did not behave like visitors passing through a small town. They sat with the quiet discipline of people gathering for something sacred. Some held coffee cups between both hands, as though steadying themselves before a funeral. Others kept their eyes lowered toward old photographs placed on the table in front of them. Emily noticed gray hair, stiff backs, scarred fingers, and the slow movements of men whose bodies had aged far more than their loyalty. No one laughed loudly. No one bragged about miles ridden. Even the waitresses, usually quick with gossip, moved carefully around the tables, as if the air itself had become heavy with memory. Daniel was waiting in a booth near the back. Beside him sat Sam Turner and Richard Collins, and between them lay a leather pouch, worn smooth from decades of handling. Emily sat across from them without opening her notebook at first. Something about the moment felt too human to reduce immediately into quotes. Daniel noticed and gave her a faint approving smile. Jack would have liked that, he said. Emily looked at him. Liked what? That you waited before turning pain into a story? The words struck her more deeply than she expected. She placed her notebook beside her coffee and folded her hands on the table. I don't want to get this wrong. Sam leaned back slightly, his eyes soft but tired. Then don't start with the tragedy. Everybody always wants to start with the day everything fell apart, but that's not where Michael Reed begins. Daniel nodded and touched the leather pouch with 2 fingers. Michael was the first man who believed Jack's dream could become bigger than 6 riders helping strangers on weekends. Jack had the fire, the courage, and the kind of voice men followed without knowing why. Michael had the patience to turn that fire into something that could last. When Jack wanted to ride straight into a problem, Michael was the one who made sure they brought food, tools, money, and enough men to finish the job properly. Richard smiled with visible effort. Michael remembered birthdays. He remembered the names of every rider's children. If somebody missed a meeting, Jack noticed the absence, but Michael found out why. He was the heart of the brotherhood, and Jack knew it better than anyone. Emily listened as the 3 men slowly brought Michael back to life with their words. They described a man who could calm a room before anger destroyed it, who carried extra gloves because someone always forgot theirs, who wrote letters by hand to the families Iron Brotherhood helped, so they would never feel like charity cases. Michael had been the kind of man strong people trusted because he never needed to prove he was strong. Through their stories, Emily began to see why his death had shattered Jack so completely. Losing Michael had not merely taken away a friend. It had torn out the moral center of the family they had built together. Daniel finally opened the leather pouch and removed an old photograph. It showed a younger Jack standing beside Michael Reed, in front of a long row of motorcycles. Jack's arm rested across Michael's shoulders, and both men were laughing with the unguarded joy of people who still believed time would give them more than it would take. Emily studied Michael's face. He looked warm, steady, and alive, in a way that made the later silence around his name feel even more painful. This was taken 1 week before the last ride, Daniel said quietly. Emily felt the atmosphere around the table change. The men did not look away, but something in their expressions tightened, as though they had reached the edge of a road none of them wanted to travel again. What happened on that ride? She asked, keeping her voice gentle. Sam stared at the photograph for a long moment before answering. A meeting was called at Sullivan Auto Salvage, not a public event, not a charity ride. It was supposed to be senior members only because Jack and Michael had discovered that someone had been using the Brotherhood's name to move stolen money through fake donation accounts. Emily's breath caught. Someone inside the Brotherhood. Daniel's jaw tightened. That was the suspicion, and Jack wanted proof before he accused a brother. Michael wanted to bring it quietly to the men they trusted most, settle it without destroying everything good they had built. Richard's fingers curled around his coffee cup. But whoever was behind it knew they were getting close. For several seconds, Emily heard only the low noise of the diner around them. Plates moving, coffee pouring, engines ticking as they cooled outside. Then Daniel slid another photograph across the table. This one showed the central garage of Sullivan Auto Salvage before it burned. Emily recognized the building from the blueprint she had found. Seeing it intact made the mystery feel suddenly real. The night of that meeting, Daniel continued, the garage went up in flames before anyone outside knew what was happening. Some men got out, some didn't. Michael made it out once, then went back in because Jack was still inside. Emily looked at the photograph, then at Daniel. Daniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes had begun to shine. Michael carried Jack through the side entrance. Witnesses said Jack fought him the entire way because other brothers were still trapped. Michael got him clear, turned around, and went back again. Sam closed his eyes. He never came out. The sentence did not sound dramatic. It sounded unbearable. Emily suddenly understood the pocket watch, the Harley, the ruined garage, and the way Jack had touched the covered motorcycle as though it were a grave marker. Michael had not simply died in a tragedy. He had chosen to save Jack, and Jack had survived with that knowledge carved into him every single day afterward. Daniel pushed the leather pouch toward Emily. Inside lay a folded letter, sealed but yellowed with age. Michael wrote this before the meeting. He gave it to Thomas Walker and told him that if anything happened, Jack should receive it when the Brotherhood was ready to finish what they started. Emily stared at the letter without touching it. Why didn't Jack get it 30 years ago? Richard looked toward the window where more riders were arriving. In silence. Because after the funerals, Jack vanished before any of us knew how to reach him. Some of us searched for years. Others were too ashamed to try hard enough. By the time we found out he was here, the man who had the letter was dying, and he made us promise we would not deliver it one by one like cowards. He said if we were going to return Michael's words, we would return as brothers. Emily's throat tightened. That is why everyone is coming? Daniel nodded. Not to honor the past from a safe distance, to stand in front of Jack and admit that we let him carry too much alone. Outside, another motorcycle rolled into the lot, followed by two more. The diner grew quieter as the riders watched them park. Emily saw no spectacle in their arrival, only men answering a summons that had waited half their lives. For the first time, she understood that the convoy forming around Redstone was not a display of power meant to impress the town. It was an act of repentance. When Emily finally left the diner, she carried no article draft and no easy headline. She carried Michael Reed's name, Jack Sullivan's guilt, and the terrible knowledge that somewhere inside the junkyard, an old man still believed he had been abandoned by the very family now crossing America to ask his forgiveness. By the time she reached her car, she noticed a sheriff's cruiser parked across the street. Victor Kane stood beside it, speaking quietly with two uniformed officers, while watching the motorcycles with a smile that did not match the fear in his eyes. Emily slowed instinctively, understanding that the man who wanted Jack's land had just realized this was no longer a simple property dispute. Victor turned his head and saw her watching. His smile widened. And in that moment, Emily knew he had already begun planning how to destroy Jack before the brothers could reach him. Emily didn't drive away immediately. She remained inside her car, watching Victor Kane shake hands with the sheriff before both men disappeared into the municipal building across the street. Their conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, yet something about Victor's confidence unsettled her. It wasn't the confidence of a businessman negotiating another land purchase. It was the confidence of someone who believed time was finally working in his favor. As more motorcycles entered Redstone with each passing hour, Victor wasn't becoming nervous because of the riders themselves. He was becoming nervous because they threatened something he had spent years trying to keep buried. The thought followed Emily all the way back to the junkyard. She found Jack standing inside the remains of the old garage, staring silently at the cracked concrete floor where the building had once stood. Until that moment, Emily had never seen him wander into that part of the property. He wasn't searching for tools or salvaging old equipment. He simply stood there, as though the ground beneath his boots still held voices only he could hear. She approached quietly, unwilling to disturb whatever memory had brought him there. "I saw Victor Kane in town," she said after a long silence. Jack didn't turn around. I expected him. He was talking to the sheriff. I expected that too. Emily studied his face. There was no surprise, no concern, not even curiosity. It was almost as though he had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. You don't seem worried, she said. Jack finally looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, there was something almost weary in his eyes. Worry only changes the man carrying it, he replied. It never changes what's coming. Emily walked beside him and looked across the empty concrete slab. Frank told me this building burned down during the last meeting. Jack nodded once. He also told me Michael died saving your life. The old biker closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. He told you more than I ever could. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had weighed on her all morning. Did you ever find out who betrayed the Brotherhood? Jack's gaze drifted toward the far corner of the ruined foundation. There were times I thought I had. He paused. And there were times I prayed I was wrong. Emily frowned. You still don't know. Jack slowly knelt beside a cracked section of concrete and brushed away years of accumulated dust with the palm of his hand. Underneath lay a faint steel outline, almost invisible beneath the weathered surface. Emily stepped closer. What is that? A door. Her heartbeat quickened. There was a basement. Jack nodded. The safest room in the building. Emily immediately remembered the original blueprint she had found at the newspaper office. The underground storage room. Jack rested his hand against the cold steel. That's where the meeting was supposed to happen. Emily stared at the hidden outline beneath the concrete. Has anyone opened it since the fire? Jack's answer came almost as a whisper. No. Why? Because I sealed it myself. Emily looked at him in disbelief. You never went back inside? I couldn't. His voice remained calm, but Emily heard the pain beneath every word. Everything that mattered was buried under that floor. She looked from Jack to the hidden steel door again. Then why not open it? Now Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stood and looked toward the old Harley parked nearby. For 30 years, he said quietly, I've asked myself the same question every morning. Emily waited. I always found another reason not to. His eyes remained fixed on the motorcycle. Sometimes fear disguises itself as loyalty. Before Emily could respond, the sound of tires echoed outside the junkyard once again. Another rider entered through the broken gate, this time followed by 3 more motorcycles. The first man removed his helmet before the engine had even fallen silent. Jack recognized him instantly. Ben. The rider smiled with visible emotion. I've been looking forward to saying that for 30 years. Jack walked toward him, and the 2 men embraced without hesitation. Emily watched as the other riders climbed off their motorcycles. Their ages varied, but every one of them carried the same expression upon seeing Jack. None of them pitied him. None of them appeared shocked by the way he lived. They greeted him exactly as though no time had passed since they had last ridden together. One by one, they reached into their saddlebags. One man placed an old photograph on the workbench. Another laid down a worn pair of leather riding gloves. A third carefully unwrapped a tarnished sheriff's badge. Ben was the last. He removed a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case, and handed it to Jack with both hands. I've protected this long enough. Jack accepted it carefully. His fingers trembled before he even opened the lid. Inside rested a silver ring engraved with the same wolf emblem Emily had come to recognize so well. Jack closed his eyes. Michael's. Ben nodded. He gave it to me the morning of the meeting. Emily remained perfectly still. What did he say? Jack asked, his voice barely audible. Ben swallowed hard. He told me. His voice broke before he forced himself to continue. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I wasn't allowed to let you blame yourself. Silence settled across the junkyard. No one moved. No one spoke. Jack stared at the ring as though 30 years had disappeared in an instant. Finally, he looked up. I blamed myself anyway. None of the riders tried to argue, because every one of them knew it was true. Jack had carried that burden longer than any man should. Ben placed a hand gently on his shoulder. That's why we're here. Jack looked around at the growing circle of familiar faces. You should have stayed home. Ben smiled through tear-filled eyes. We tried. A few of the older riders laughed quietly, the first genuine laughter Emily had heard since this journey began. We all tried, another man admitted. But every year someone would ask the same question. Jack looked at him. What question? The rider took a slow breath. When are we finally going back for our brother? Jack lowered his head. For the first time in decades, he began to understand that he had not spent 30 years alone. The loneliness he believed belonged only to him had been shared by every man standing before him. Just then, the quiet reunion was interrupted by the sharp sound of an engine accelerating outside the gate. A black SUV rolled to a stop. Victor Kames stepped out. This time he didn't come alone. Behind him stood 2 lawyers and 3 county officials carrying sealed documents. Victor looked directly at Jack before unfolding the first sheet of paper. I was hoping to avoid this, he said, his voice carrying across the junkyard. But as of this morning, he paused just long enough for every rider to hear him. This property has officially been approved for compulsory acquisition. The smiles disappeared. The reunion was over. The battle had begun. For several long seconds, no one inside the junkyard moved. The arrival of Victor Kane and the county officials had shattered the quiet reunion as completely as if someone had driven a blade through 30 years of carefully guarded memories. Emily instinctively reached for her camera, but before she could press the record button, Jack gently raised one hand. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible. Yet every rider standing behind him understood it immediately. No one stepped forward. No one argued. No one reached for Victor. They remained exactly where they were. Victor noticed the discipline at once. His eyes swept across the growing circle of gray-haired bikers before settling on Jack once again. He had expected anger. He had expected shouting. Instead, he found nearly 40 men standing in complete silence, their calmness making the atmosphere far more intimidating than any threat could have. Victor forced a smile. I see you've invited company. Jack met his gaze without changing expression. They invited themselves. Victor glanced briefly toward the motorcycles lined along the fence before looking back at the county officials beside him. I'm afraid that changes nothing. One of the officials stepped forward, carrying a thick folder stamped with the county seal. He cleared his throat awkwardly before addressing Jack. Mr. Sullivan, under the redevelopment agreement approved by the county board, this property has been designated for commercial acquisition. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before demolition begins. Emily immediately stepped closer. On what grounds? The official hesitated. This matter doesn't concern the press. It concerns anyone watching abuse of public authority. Victor answered before the official could. The land has been abandoned for decades. The buildings are unsafe. The business license expired years ago, and environmental inspectors have already declared most of the property beyond repair. Emily frowned. That still doesn't explain compulsory acquisition. Victor's smile widened slightly. There's going to be a veterans rehabilitation center built here. Several people standing nearby nodded quietly after hearing those words. On the surface, it sounded like an honorable project. Even Emily felt herself hesitate for a brief moment. Victor noticed. It's difficult to oppose a rehabilitation center for wounded veterans, he continued smoothly. Surely no one wants an abandoned junkyard standing in its place. Jack listened without interrupting. Only after Victor finished speaking did he quietly ask a single question. Who owns the construction company? Victor's smile faded almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure that's relevant. It is. The silence that followed answered more than Victor intended. Emily looked toward the county officials. None of them volunteered an answer. Jack nodded slowly. I thought so. Victor folded the documents together. Whether you approve or not, the decision has already been made. Jack looked around the junkyard before letting his eyes settle on the remains of the burned garage. I've heard those words before. Victor frowned. What does that mean? Jack's voice remained steady. 30 years ago, another man believed a decision had already been made. Emily felt the riders behind her exchange silent glances. Victor had no idea what Jack was talking about. I don't have time for old stories, Victor replied, but they have time for you. Jack's answer sounded almost sorrowful. Victor laughed dismissively. I'm offering compensation. Jack slowly shook his head. You aren't buying land. He looked directly into Victor's eyes. You're trying to erase it. For the first time since arriving, Victor's confidence cracked. Only slightly. Only for a second. But Emily saw it. Jack had struck something Victor hadn't expected anyone to understand. Emily's mind raced back to the old blueprint, the destroyed garage, the hidden underground room, and the mysterious fire that had ended Iron Brotherhood's final meeting. Suddenly, the timing of everything no longer felt like coincidence. Victor hadn't appeared because hundreds of bikers were coming. He had appeared because he was afraid of what those bikers might discover. The realization hit Emily so suddenly that she almost spoke it aloud. Victor wasn't interested in the junkyard. He was interested in whatever remained beneath it. Jack seems to reach the same conclusion at the same moment. You've wanted this property for years. Victor remained silent. You kept increasing your offers. Still no answer. And now, just days before old witnesses begin arriving, Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. You suddenly receive approval to destroy everything. Emily watched Victor's jaw tighten. It was the first genuine reaction he had shown. You should be careful where your imagination takes you, Victor said. Jack smiled faintly. My imagination has nothing to do with it. He slowly turned toward the cracked foundation of the old garage. You've never cared about this junkyard. His voice became quieter. You've been waiting for permission to bury it forever. A heavy silence settled across the property. Emily noticed one of Victor's lawyers shift uneasily. Another official lowered his eyes. Even they seemed uncomfortable now. Victor folded the documents sharply. I'll return in 72 hours. He looked directly at Jack. If you're still here. His gaze drifted toward the motorcycles. The sheriff will remove everyone. Jack didn't answer. He simply watched Victor walk back toward the SUV. The vehicle disappeared through the broken gate, taking the county officials with it. No one spoke until the sound of the engine had completely faded. Finally, Ben broke the silence. He knows. Jack nodded. He's always known. Daniel stepped closer. You think the evidence is still down there? Jack looked once more toward the cracked concrete floor covering the underground room. I don't know. His voice carried none of the certainty it once had. I stopped believing anything survived that fire a long time ago. Richard slowly removed his gloves. Then maybe it's time we stop believing. Jack looked at him. Richard smiled gently. It's time we find out. One by one, the riders turned toward the old garage. No one needed to explain what came next. For 30 years, they had waited for Jack to decide whether the past should remain buried. Now, for the first time, they were all standing together in the place where everything had ended. Jack looked at every familiar face surrounding him, before slowly lowering his eyes to the cracked concrete beneath his feet. He took a long breath. Then, after 30 years of refusing to touch the place that haunted every waking moment of his life, he quietly spoke the words every man there had hoped to hear. Tomorrow morning, he paused as though the sentence itself carried the weight of 3 decades. We open the basement. No one cheered, no one celebrated, because every rider understood the same thing. Whatever had survived beneath that concrete floor would either free Jack Sullivan or destroy the last part of him that 30 years of guilt had failed to break. No one slept well that night. The riders scattered across Redstone's small motels, rented cabins, and spare bedrooms offered by people who had gradually begun to realize these visitors were unlike any group that had ever passed through their town. Yet, even after the lights went out, sleep remained elusive. 30 years of unanswered questions had finally led them back to the place where everything had fallen apart. And by sunrise, every man knew his life might change before the day was over. Jack hardly closed his eyes. He remained inside the old bus, sitting at the small wooden table where Michael's pocket watch, the silver ring, and the unopened letter rested side by side. For years he had imagined this moment countless times, always convincing himself that opening the underground room would bring nothing except ashes and disappointment. Now, for the first time, he was no longer facing that fear alone. The brothers he believed had abandoned him had returned carrying pieces of a past he thought had vanished forever. Instead of bringing accusations, they had brought forgiveness. Instead of demanding explanations, they had quietly stood beside him. It was a kindness Jack felt he had done nothing to deserve. Before sunrise, Emily arrived at the junkyard and found several motorcycles already parked near the remains of the old garage. The riders spoke softly among themselves while unloading crowbars, flashlights, ropes, portable generators, and heavy construction tools from their saddlebags and pickup trucks. None of them behaved like treasure hunters chasing a forgotten secret. Their movements carried the quiet respect of men preparing to enter sacred ground. Daniel noticed Emily approaching and handed her a yellow construction helmet. "You'll need this." Emily accepted it with a puzzled smile. "You already planned for me to be here." Daniel looked toward Jack, who was slowly walking across the yard with Michael's pocket watch tucked safely inside his vest. "Jack said, if the truth finally comes out," Daniel replied. "Someone has to make sure the world hears it exactly as it happened." Emily glanced at Jack in surprise. He said that Daniel nodded. He spent 30 years hiding from his own story. His expression softened. Maybe he's finally ready to let someone else carry it. A few moments later, every rider gathered around the cracked concrete foundation. The old steel outline hidden beneath years of dust had been completely uncovered, revealing a square access hatch almost forgotten by time. Rust covered its surface, but the thick locking mechanism remained visible beneath the corrosion. Jack stepped forward. His hand rested lightly against the cold steel without trying to move it. "I built this room myself," he said quietly. It was supposed to protect documents donation records and emergency funds during wildfire season. We thought nothing could destroy it. Richard looked down at the heavy hatch. Maybe nothing did. Jack gave him a faint smile, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. "I've told myself for 30 years that whatever was inside burned with everything else." Ben gently placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Then let's stop guessing." Several men positioned long steel bars beneath the edge of the hatch, while others connected the portable generator to an electric cutting tool. The first attempt barely moved the door. Rust had fused the hinges to the surrounding frame after decades beneath the burned foundation. No one complained. The riders simply adjusted their positions and tried again. Metal groaned beneath the combined strength of aging shoulders that had once crossed mountains together. Some of the men winced as old injuries protested every movement. Yet none stepped away. Their bodies had grown older, but the determination Emily saw on their faces belonged to much younger men. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before a sharp cracking sound echoed across the junkyard. The seal had finally broken. A cloud of stale air escaped from beneath the hatch, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of smoke trapped for 3 decades. Every conversation stopped. Jack instinctively closed his eyes. For one terrifying moment, he was no longer standing in the quiet morning surrounded by old friends. He was back inside the burning garage. He could hear collapsing beams. He could hear motorcycles falling onto concrete. Most painfully of all, he could hear Michael shouting his name. Jack staggered backward. Emily moved instinctively, but Ben reached him first. Easy. Jack struggled to steady his breathing. I heard him. Ben looked at him with deep understanding. I know. For several moments, no one touched the hatch again. The silence wasn't hesitation. It was respect. Every rider understood that Jack wasn't battling rust or concrete. He was battling 30 years of guilt. Finally, Jack straightened his shoulders and nodded once. Open it. The men pulled together. The heavy steel hatch rose slowly, protesting every inch, before finally swinging wide enough to reveal a narrow concrete staircase disappearing into darkness. Emily shined her flashlight downward. The underground room remained almost completely intact. Dust covered everything. Broken shelves leaned against the walls. Cardboard boxes had collapsed long ago. Yet the reinforced ceiling had survived exactly as Jack designed it decades earlier. Richard looked toward him. It held. Jack couldn't answer. He simply stared at the room that had haunted every night of his life. Daniel switched on another flashlight. I'll go first. Jack immediately shook his head. No. Every rider looked toward him. This was my decision. He paused before taking the first step onto the staircase. So it has to be my responsibility. Emily watched him disappear slowly into the darkness, followed closely by Ben and Daniel. The rest of the riders waited above in complete silence, listening only to the sound of cautious footsteps echoing beneath the concrete. Several minutes passed. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. Then Jack's voice finally echoed upward. Quiet, unsteady, filled with disbelief. Ben. There was a long pause. I found something. Emily gripped the flashlight tighter. What is it she called down? Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, another silence settled beneath the ground before his voice rose once more. This time it carried something no one had heard from him since the brothers returned. Hope. The files. His words trembled. They're still here. Every rider standing above exchanged stunned glances. If the donation records, meeting minutes, financial ledgers, and correspondence had survived the fire, then the truth buried for 30 years might have survived with them. But as Daniel reached toward the first metal filing cabinet, his flashlight reflected off something hidden beneath the layer of dust. He froze. Jack. Jack turned. Daniel slowly knelt beside a dark object lying near the far wall. After brushing away decades of dirt, he uncovered a scorched leather briefcase. Across its cracked surface, burned but still unmistakable, were two embossed initials. VK. No one in the room needed to ask whose initials those were. Jack stared at the briefcase without blinking. 30 years earlier, Victor Kane had sworn he had never been anywhere near Sullivan Auto Salvage on the night of the fire. Now buried beneath the burned garage, no outsider was ever supposed to enter, lay a briefcase carrying his name. And for the first time since returning to Redstone, Jack realized that the man trying hardest to destroy the junkyard might not simply know the truth. He might have been there the night everything was stolen. For several long moments, no one inside the underground room spoke. Every flashlight remained fixed on the scorched leather briefcase lying beside the damaged filing cabinet, as though the object itself had frozen time. Jack Sullivan slowly knelt in front of it, but instead of reaching for the handle, he simply stared at the burned initials pressed into the cracked leather. VK. 30 years had passed, yet he recognized those initials immediately. Victor Kane. Emily climbed carefully down the concrete stairs until she stood beside Jack. She looked from the briefcase to his face and realized that the color had drained from it. This wasn't the expression of a man discovering new evidence. It was the expression of someone watching an old nightmare suddenly become real. You've seen this before. she said quietly. Jack nodded without taking his eyes off the briefcase. I remember Michael carrying it. Emily frowned. I thought it belonged to Victor. It did. Jack finally looked up, his voice carrying the weight of memories that had refused to fade. The week before the meeting, Victor came to the garage asking us to sponsor one of his construction projects. He claimed he wanted to build affordable housing for veterans. Michael handled most of the paperwork, and Victor always carried this briefcase. Emily's heartbeat quickened. You trusted him. Jack lowered his head. We trusted almost everyone back then. Daniel slowly stepped closer. I thought Victor only appeared years later. So did I, Ben admitted quietly. Jack shook his head. No, he wasn't part of the Brotherhood, but he knew us. His words settled heavily across the room. Emily suddenly understood why Victor had been so desperate to erase the junkyard. If his briefcase had remained buried beneath the burned garage for 3 decades, then whatever happened on the night of the fire had connected him to that tragedy far earlier than anyone imagined. Jack reached forward and carefully lifted the briefcase from the floor. The leather had hardened with age, and the brass lock had melted slightly during the fire, but the case itself remained intact. Richard examined it closely. It survived better than anything else. Jack gave a faint nod. It was fireproof. Emily looked at him in surprise. How do you know that? Jack managed a tired smile. Because Victor spent 20 minutes telling Michael why it was worth buying. A painful silence followed. Every small detail seemed to pull Victor closer to the center of a mystery he had spent decades pretending never existed. Ben removed a small pry bar from his tool belt. The locks fused shut. Jack took the tool from his hand. No. Everyone looked at him. If there's any chance the papers inside survived. He paused. I won't risk destroying them. Daniel pointed toward one corner of the room, where an old steel toolbox sat beneath a collapsed shelf. I think I remember something. He walked across the room and knelt beside the box. After forcing the rusted lid open, he searched through old tools covered in ash before suddenly stopping. A faint smile appeared on his face. I knew Michael wouldn't have thrown it away. He held up a small ring of keys. Jack stared at them in disbelief. They're still here, Daniel nodded. The master keys. Jack accepted the ring with hands that were no longer as steady as he wanted them to be. Each key carried a small brass tag, blackened by smoke, but still readable beneath the soot. He slowly sorted through them until one key stopped him. A faded white label. Office safe. Beneath it, Victor Kane. Emily felt the room grow completely silent. Jack looked at the key for several seconds before sliding it carefully into the damaged lock. No one breathed. The old mechanism resisted at first, then released with a dull metallic click that echoed through the underground room. Jack slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of documents wrapped inside waterproof plastic sleeves. The fire had scorched the edges of the folders, but everything inside remained astonishingly well preserved. Emily immediately understood why Victor wanted the junkyard destroyed before anyone returned. If these records survived, so did the truth. Jack removed the first folder and carefully opened it. Property contracts, donation ledgers, construction invoices. Everything appeared ordinary. Ben released a disappointed sigh. It might just be business paperwork. Jack didn't answer. He continued turning pages one by one until a folded envelope slipped from the center of the file and landed softly on the concrete floor. Across the front, written in Michael Reed's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. If anything happens, read this first. Jack froze. His fingers refused to move. Emily looked at him gently. Jack. He closed his eyes. I can't. His voice cracked for the first time. I've imagined this letter for 30 years. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to read it alone. Jack slowly picked up the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but the wax seal remained unbroken. Michael had written those words, knowing there was a possibility he would never return. Jack traced the seal with his thumb, his breathing growing heavier with every passing second. Above them, dozens of riders waited in complete silence, unaware that the first real piece of the past had finally been found. Emily instinctively reached for her notebook before stopping herself. This wasn't a moment for journalism. It was a moment for family. Jack looked around at the brothers standing beside him. For 30 years he had believed he carried this burden alone. Now every familiar face was waiting to carry it with him. With trembling hands he finally broke the seal. The folded pages opened slowly. The first line was written in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. Jack read only a single sentence before his entire body went still. His lips parted. The color drained from his face. Without realizing it, he whispered the words aloud. Jack, if you're reading this, it means I was right about Victor. The underground room fell into complete silence after Jack whispered those words. No one reached for the letter. No one urged him to continue. Even the steady hum of the portable generator seemed to fade into the background, as every man present understood they were standing at the edge of a truth that had waited 3 decades to be spoken aloud. Jack swallowed slowly before forcing himself to continue reading. Michael's handwriting remained firm from the first line to the last, as though he had written the letter with complete clarity, fully aware that every word might someday become the only voice he could leave behind. If you're holding this letter, then something has gone terribly wrong. I pray I'm only being overly cautious, but I have learned enough over the past month to believe we have been looking in the wrong direction. We kept searching for a traitor among our own brothers, because we believed only someone inside Iron Brotherhood could know our plans. I no longer believe that. I believe the betrayal began long before it reached us. Jack paused, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered the countless meetings where he had questioned his own brothers, the sleepless nights spent wondering which familiar face had sold them out, and the quiet resentment that had slowly poisoned friendships built over decades. Every suspicion had cut deeper than the last, because he had believed the betrayal had come from within. His voice grew heavier as he continued. Victor Kane lied the day he asked us to invest in his veterans' housing project. I followed the money myself. None of it reached construction companies. Large transfers disappeared into shell accounts that didn't exist before his proposal. Someone inside the county office approved documents that should never have been approved, and every signature leads back to people connected to Victor. Emily instinctively looked toward the briefcase lying open on the floor. The construction project Victor had recently announced suddenly felt disturbingly familiar. He had used almost the same promise 30 years earlier, speaking about helping veterans, while quietly moving money somewhere no one would think to investigate. Jack slowly lowered the first page before unfolding the second. I haven't told you everything, because I wanted proof before placing this burden on your shoulders. Tomorrow's meeting isn't only about exposing financial fraud. Inside Victor's briefcase are original contracts, payment records, and a ledger connecting every illegal transfer. If those documents become public, powerful people will lose far more than money. They'll lose careers, influence, and freedom. That's why I believe someone will try to stop us before the meeting begins. Daniel felt his chest tighten. So Michael already knew. Jack nodded faintly without looking up. He knew before any of us. Ben rubbed both hands across his face, struggling to process what he was hearing. He was trying to protect us. Jack answered almost in a whisper. He was trying to protect everyone. Emily noticed something that hadn't occurred to anyone else. If Michael knew Victor was involved, why didn't he go to the police? Jack looked at her with tired eyes. He did. Emily frowned. What happened? Jack continued reading until another paragraph answered the question for him. I contacted 2 investigators. Neither one returned my calls after meeting with county officials. One resigned 3 days later. The other disappeared from the case without explanation. If this letter reaches you, trust very carefully. Someone with authority is protecting Victor. Emily felt a chill settle across her shoulders. Everything Victor had done since arriving in Redstone suddenly made sense. His confidence wasn't born from arrogance alone. It came from years of knowing that the people who should have investigated him had never done so. Jack unfolded the final page. The paper shook slightly in his hands. There's one more thing you need to know. If I don't make it home, don't spend your life blaming yourself. None of this is your fault. You gave people hope when they had forgotten how to believe in tomorrow. Don't let my death become the reason that hope dies with you. Finish what we started. Promise me you won't disappear. Jack stopped reading. His breathing became uneven. For 30 years, he had done the exact opposite of what Michael had asked. He had disappeared. He had abandoned the Brotherhood. He had convinced himself that every funeral, every widow, every fatherless child existed because he had failed as a leader. The letter in his hands shattered that belief in a matter of minutes. Ben stepped beside him. Jack. Jack slowly shook his head, unable to speak. Daniel quietly took the final page from his trembling hands and continued reading aloud. If the day ever comes when our brothers gather again, tell them I never regretted going back into that fire. A brother doesn't calculate the cost before saving family. That's what we promised each other from the very beginning. If anyone carries guilt after I'm gone, then everything we built together will have meant nothing. No one in the room could hide the emotion on their faces anymore. Richard removed his glasses and wiped away tears he had tried unsuccessfully to conceal. Ben lowered his head. Daniel closed the letter carefully before handing it back to Jack. For several minutes, nobody spoke. 30 years of silence had finally been broken by the only voice capable of reaching every man standing in that underground room. Emily looked toward Jack. What happened after Michael went back inside? Jack stared at the letter resting in his hands before answering. I never knew. His voice remained quiet. When I woke up in the hospital, everyone told me the fire spread too quickly. He paused. I never questioned it. Emily looked toward the burned briefcase again. But now you do. Jack slowly nodded. Michael believed someone wanted those documents destroyed. His eyes drifted across the room until they settled on the old filing cabinets lining the far wall. If he was right, he looked toward Daniel. Then the proof didn't burn. Without another word, the riders spread through the underground room, opening cabinet after cabinet with renewed determination. Every shelf they searched carried the possibility of exposing the truth Michael had died trying to protect. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Richard called out from the opposite corner, I found another safe. Everyone turned. Hidden behind a collapsed metal cabinet stood a heavy wall safe, blackened by smoke but still embedded firmly in reinforced concrete. Unlike the burned briefcase, this safe had never been forced open. Jack approached slowly. He recognized it immediately. This wasn't here before. Emily looked at him. What do you mean? Jack ran his fingers across the steel door I built this room. His voice became noticeably quieter. I never installed a second safe. The realization spread through the room almost instantly. Someone had entered the underground room after construction was finished and hidden an entirely new safe inside the wall without Jack ever knowing. Ben looked toward the riders behind him. If Jack didn't build it, Daniel finished the sentence for him. Then somebody wanted to hide something even from Iron Brotherhood. Jack stared at the unfamiliar safe for several long seconds before whispering words that sent another wave of silence through the underground room. Michael wasn't protecting the documents. He slowly looked up. He was protecting whatever is inside that safe. And somewhere above them, completely unaware that the first cracks had begun appearing in a conspiracy buried for 3 decades, Victor Kane was already making preparations to ensure no one inside the junkyard would ever have the chance to open it. The discovery of the hidden safe changed the atmosphere inside the underground room more profoundly than Michael's letter had. The letter had answered questions that haunted them for 30 years, but the safe represented something entirely different. It represented the possibility that the truth had survived untouched all this time, waiting beneath layers of concrete, while men mourned, blamed themselves, and slowly drifted apart. Jack stood motionless before the steel door, studying every inch of it. The workmanship was professional. The frame had been poured directly into reinforced concrete after the room was completed, which meant someone had returned later with enough authority, money, and time to alter the structure without his knowledge. That realization disturbed him more than anything else he had found underground. "I walked through this room hundreds of times," he said quietly. "I checked every wall myself before we held meetings down here." Daniel examined the concrete surrounding the safe. "Then, someone wanted this hidden so badly that they rebuilt part of your wall." Jack slowly nodded. "And they knew I'd never notice." Emily watched the old biker's expression change as another painful realization settled over him. For decades, he had believed the greatest mistake of his life had been trusting the wrong people. Now he was beginning to understand that the betrayal had been planned long before Iron Brotherhood ever gathered for its final meeting. Someone had prepared this room in advance, patiently building the perfect trap, while Jack remained convinced he was protecting his brothers. Richard knelt beside the safe and brushed away years of soot from the metal surface. Unlike the filing cabinets and the burned briefcase, the door showed remarkably little damage. Only the combination dial had cracked during the fire. "It's still locked," he said. Ben leaned closer. "If nobody opened it after the fire..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Whatever rested inside had remained sealed for 30 years. Jack reached toward the dial, but stopped before touching it. "I don't know the combination." Daniel frowned. "You've never seen this safe before?" Jack shook his head. "I don't even know who installed it." Emily carefully looked around the room. Her eyes moved from the hidden safe to the scattered filing cabinets before settling on the burned briefcase lying open on the floor. Then something occurred to her. Michael. Every face turned toward her. He knew. Jack looked at her in confusion. He wrote the letter. Emily continued her thoughts, racing faster with every word. "He specifically mentioned Victor's briefcase. He told you the documents were inside it, but he never wrote where they had been moved afterward. What if he found this safe before the meeting?" Daniel's breathing slowed. That would explain something. What Jack asked. Daniel looked toward the wall. "I always wondered why Michael arrived almost 40 minutes before everyone else that evening." Jack searched his memory. "He said he wanted to organize the donation files." Daniel nodded. "That's what all of us believed." Ben slowly straightened. "But maybe..." His voice became barely audible. He came early because he'd already discovered the safe. Silence returned to the room. Every new answer seemed to create an even larger question. Jack closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember details buried beneath 30 years of grief. Faces, conversations, gestures, ordinary moments that had seemed meaningless at the time now resurfaced with startling clarity. Then he remembered the toolbox. Daniel looked at him. "What toolbox?" "The red toolbox." Jack opened his eyes. Michael wouldn't let anyone touch it that day. Richard frowned. "I remember that." Jack continued speaking, almost to himself. He said he was fixing one of the cabinet locks. Emily felt her pulse quicken. But he wasn't. Jack slowly turned toward the far side of the room. He was hiding something. Without another word, he walked toward an old workbench buried beneath collapsed shelving. The wood had partially burned, but beneath the debris, a rusted red toolbox remained exactly where it had been left decades earlier. Jack knelt slowly. His hands trembled as he brushed away the ash. "I bought this from Michael on his birthday." He smiled faintly. He complained that his old one was too small. Daniel crouched beside him. It never was. Jack opened the lid. Inside lay ordinary mechanics tools, each carefully arranged despite the years. Wrenches, screwdrivers, socket sets, nothing unusual. Emily watched Jack study the contents without speaking. He always organized everything. Jack murmured he hated clutter. He removed each tool one by one until only the empty metal tray remained. Then he stopped. No. Daniel looked at him. What is it? Jack lifted the tray. Hidden beneath it was a folded sheet of thick paper sealed inside a transparent plastic envelope. No one breathed. Jack carefully removed it. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch of the underground room. Every cabinet, every table, every support beam, everything had been labeled in Michael's handwriting. Emily leaned closer. It's a map. Jack's eyes moved across the page. Then they stopped. Near the hidden safe, Michael had circled a small section of the wall and written a single sentence. If you're reading this, the truth survived. Jack's throat tightened. Below the sentence was another line, written more hastily, as though Michael had run out of time. The combination isn't numbers. Think about what we built together. Daniel looked at the safe again. Not numbers. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Jack studied the note in silence. Michael knew him better than anyone alive. If he had left a clue, instead of the actual combination, it meant he believed only Jack would understand it. Emily watched the old biker close his eyes once more. She could almost see him searching through decades of memories, trying to hear a voice that had been silent for 30 years. Then, very slowly, Jack smiled. It wasn't a smile of certainty. It was recognition. I know. Every rider stepped closer. You know the combination, Ben asked. Jack looked toward the hidden safe. I know what Michael wanted me to remember. He walked slowly across the room until he stood before the steel door again. Instead of reaching for the damaged combination dial, he placed his hand gently against the cold metal, exactly the way he touched the old Harley every morning. He used to say our brotherhood was built on 4 promises. Daniel's eyes widened. Jack nodded. Not 4 numbers. He looked around at the men surrounding him. 4 promises. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken as Jack slowly reached for the combination dial. 30 years earlier, Michael hadn't trusted a code that could be stolen. He had trusted something only the true founder of Iron Brotherhood would never forget. Jack rested his fingers on the cracked dial. Then, one by one, he began turning it. Every man in the underground room watched Jack's hand as it rested on the cracked combination dial. 30 years earlier, no one would have questioned his next decision. Back then, Jack Sullivan had been the man who always knew which road to take, even when the destination remained hidden beyond the horizon. Standing before the concealed safe, however, he no longer looked like the fearless leader the Brotherhood remembered. He looked like a man asking himself whether he still deserved to be trusted with the truth Michael had died protecting. His fingers began turning the dial slowly, not with the certainty of someone recalling a combination, but with the patience of someone retracing a conversation that had never truly left his heart. The first promise Jack said quietly was that we would never ride past someone asking for help. He stopped the dial at its first position. A faint metallic click echoed from inside the locking mechanism. No one moved. Jack continued. The second was that no brother would ever face his hardest day alone. The dial turned again. Another click. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Michael had not hidden the safe behind numbers because numbers could be stolen. He had hidden it behind the principles that had built Iron Brotherhood from the very beginning. Anyone could memorize a code, but only the men who had lived those promises would understand them. Jack drew a slow breath before speaking again. The third, his voice faltered, was that truth always mattered more than reputation. He stopped the dial for a third time. The lock responded with a heavier sound. Daniel lowered his eyes. For years, they had failed that promise without realizing it. Instead of searching for the truth behind the fire, they'd accepted rumors carried guilt and allowed silence to become stronger than justice. Michael had tried to remind them of that promise in his letter, yet it had taken 3 decades for his words to reach the people who needed them most. Only one promise remained. Jack's hand rested on the dial without moving. Emily noticed the hesitation immediately. "What was the last one?" she asked softly. Jack didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the steel door as memories washed over him with painful clarity. He could see the old garage exactly as it had been before the fire. Young riders laughed while cleaning their motorcycles. Michael leaned against a workbench, teasing Jack for being too serious before every meeting. The smell of coffee mixed with engine oil. Someone had turned on an old radio. It had been an ordinary evening, until Michael looked at him just before everyone else arrived and asked one unexpected question. "If one day only one of us makes it home, what do we owe the other?" Jack remembered smiling because the question sounded ridiculous. "We owe him another ride," he had answered. Michael had shaken his head. "No." Jack could still hear the warmth in his friend's voice. "We owe him a life worth surviving for." The memory struck him with such force that his knees almost gave way. For 30 years, he had remembered those words only as a conversation between 2 friends. Now he understood. Michael hadn't been making conversation. He had been leaving Jack the final key. Jack looked toward the brothers surrounding him, many of them watching with tears already gathering in their eyes. "The last promise," he whispered. His voice trembled. "Was that if one brother fell?" He paused, struggling to finish the sentence Michael had carried in his heart until the day he died. The rest would keep riding. As the final words left his lips, Jack slowly turned the combination dial one last time. The mechanism inside the safe released with a deep, metallic thud that echoed through the underground room. No one breathed. Jack closed his eyes for a moment before reaching toward the heavy handle. His hand hesitated. 30 years of grief had led to this single moment. Everything Michael had protected, everything Victor Kane feared, everything the Brotherhood had crossed America to find. It all rested behind a door that had remained sealed longer than some of the younger riders' children had been alive. Ben stepped quietly beside Jack. "You don't have to open it alone." Jack looked at him, then at Daniel, Richard, Walter, and every familiar face standing behind them. One by one, the men who had once blamed themselves for abandoning their leader stepped forward until they formed a half-circle around the safe. For the first time in 3 decades, Jack no longer felt like the only survivor of that terrible night. He tightened his grip on the handle. Together, the brothers pulled. The heavy steel door groaned before swinging outward a few inches. A stale breath of air escaped from the compartment, carrying the scent of old paper and cold steel preserved by decades of darkness. Emily raised her flashlight. Inside were several waterproof document cases stacked with remarkable precision. On the top shelf rested a metal lockbox no larger than a briefcase. Beneath it sat dozens of bound ledgers tied with faded leather straps. Lower shelves held reel-to-reel audio tapes, sealed envelopes, and photographic negatives, carefully packed inside protective containers. Daniel stared into the safe without blinking. "My God." Richard's voice was barely audible. "He saved everything." Jack reached toward the upper shelf with trembling hands and carefully lifted the metal lockbox onto the concrete floor. A small brass plate was riveted to its lid. Engraved into the plate were 8 words that made every rider fall silent. "Property of Iron Brotherhood. Open only together." Jack slowly ran his fingers across the inscription. Michael hadn't trusted one man with the truth. He had trusted the Brotherhood. Emily watched as Jack released the 2 metal latches. The lid opened without resistance. Inside lay dozens of cassette tapes, labeled by date, several undeveloped film rolls, handwritten financial ledgers, and a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Unlike Michael's letter, this envelope bore no personal message. Across its front, someone had typed a single sentence: "Evidence to be delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Emily felt her heart pounding inside her chest. Jack carefully turned the envelope over. The seal remained unbroken. Before anyone could speak, Richard reached into the lockbox and picked up one final object resting beneath the envelope. It was a compact VHS camcorder cassette. A white label had been attached to its side. The handwriting was unmistakably Michael's. Jack read the words aloud. "Meeting room, 30 minutes before the fire." Silence swept through the underground room, every eye fixed on the cassette. If Michael had recorded that meeting, then somewhere inside that tiny strip of magnetic tape, the man who betrayed Iron Brotherhood had been waiting for them all along. No one reached for the videotape. The small cassette lay quietly inside the metal lockbox. Yet every man gathered around it understood they were looking at something far more dangerous than an old recording. For 30 years they had searched for explanations, blamed themselves for unanswered questions, and accepted a version of history written by silence. If Michael Reed had truly recorded the meeting before the fire, then the truth was no longer hidden inside memories that could be challenged or forgotten. It existed in a form no one could argue with. Jack carefully lifted the cassette from the lockbox, turning it over in his hands with extraordinary care. A thin layer of dust still clung to its plastic shell, but the tape itself appeared untouched. Michael had wrapped it inside waterproof material before sealing it away, almost as though he had expected someone would eventually return for it. Emily stepped closer. "Do you still have a player?" Jack looked at the cassette for a long moment before answering. "I might." Daniel frowned. "You kept one." Jack gave a tired smile. Michael always hated throwing old equipment away. For the first time that morning, a faint laugh passed through the brothers. It lasted only a moment, but it carried something they had not felt together in decades. Hope. Jack returned the cassette to the lockbox before looking toward the staircase. "We're not watching it down here." Ben understood immediately. "Too much dust." Jack nodded, and if this tape survived 30 years, his voice grew firmer. "I'm not risking it now." The writers carefully carried every document, every ledger, every photograph, and finally the lockbox itself back into the sunlight. As Jack emerged from the underground room, dozens of brothers waiting above instinctively stood. None of them asked what had been found. They simply looked at Jack's face. And for the first time since arriving in Redstone, they saw something that had disappeared from him years ago. Purpose. Word spread through the junkyard within minutes. More riders gathered quietly around the old garage, forming a respectful circle, while Jack carried the lockbox into the abandoned bus that had served as his home for nearly 3 decades. Emily followed him inside. The small space suddenly felt less like the shelter of a homeless man, and more like a room frozen in time. Every object had been preserved with intention. A worn coffee mug sat exactly where it always had. Michael's pocket watch rested beside the Bible on the small table. The silver ring lay next to it, catching the afternoon light. Jack knelt beside an old wooden cabinet built beneath the bus window and unlocked a narrow compartment Emily had never noticed before. Inside rested a portable television no larger than a suitcase and an aging VHS player wrapped carefully inside a canvas cover. Emily looked at him in disbelief. "You kept all this?" Jack nodded. "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." He carefully lifted the equipment onto the table, wiping away years of dust before connecting the cables with practiced hands. His movements carried no hesitation. It was obvious he had assembled the machine countless times in the past, only to lose the courage before pressing play. Daniel quietly entered the bus with Ben, Richard, Walter, and Thomas. The remaining brothers waited outside without complaint. They understood that whatever appeared on the tape belonged first to the men who had survived that night. Jack held the cassette for several moments before sliding it into the player. No one spoke. The old machine accepted the tape with a dull mechanical click. Jack's thumb hovered over the play button. His breathing became uneven. Emily watched him carefully. "You don't have to do this alone." Jack looked around the tiny bus. For 30 years, he had imagined opening this door by himself, convinced that whatever truth waited on the other side would belong to him alone. Now 6 old friends stood beside him, friends who had refused to let him carry another burden in silence. Jack slowly pressed the button. Static filled the screen. The picture rolled violently for several seconds before stabilizing into grainy black and white footage. The camera had been positioned high inside the meeting room, overlooking the long wooden table where Iron Brotherhood's senior members usually gathered. No one spoke inside the bus. Every eye remained fixed on the flickering screen. One by one, familiar faces entered the room. A younger Daniel, Richard, Walter, Thomas, Ben. Finally, Michael appeared, carrying Victor Kane's fireproof briefcase beneath one arm. Emily glanced toward Jack. His hands had tightened into fists without him realizing it. Moments later, the younger Jack entered the room as well. Seeing himself after so many years struck him harder than he expected. His hair was darker, his shoulders straighter. There was confidence in the way he greeted every brother that had long since disappeared from the man standing beside the television today. The meeting began normally. Michael distributed financial reports. Jack thanked everyone for traveling so far. Several men discussed upcoming charity rides. Nothing seemed unusual. Emily felt a brief wave of disappointment. Maybe this isn't the right tape. Jack didn't answer. His eyes never left the screen. Exactly 27 minutes into the recording, the meeting room door opened again. Every man inside the bus leaned forward simultaneously. Victor Kane walked into view, carrying the same briefcase that now lay open beside the television. He smiled confidently as he greeted everyone around the table. Emily whispered almost involuntarily, "He was there." Jack slowly nodded. "I told you." Victor placed the briefcase on the table before explaining that he had brought revised contracts for the Veterans Housing Project. His voice sounded calm, persuasive, and completely ordinary. Watching him, Emily understood how easily decent people could have trusted him. Nothing in his expression suggested deception. Michael opened the briefcase. Instead of removing contracts immediately, he looked toward Jack. His face changed. The warmth disappeared. He quietly reached beneath several folders and pulled out a thick ledger no one else expected to see. Victor's smile faded. Even through the grainy recording, the tension inside the room became unmistakable. Michael slowly stood. Then, looking directly into Victor Kane's eyes, he spoke words that froze every man inside the bus. "These aren't construction accounts." He placed the ledger firmly on the table. "These are payments." Victor remained silent. Michael continued. "Bribes." The room on the television fell completely still. The room inside the bus did exactly the same. 30 years had finally delivered them back to the precise moment everything began to unravel. Then the recording captured something none of them had expected. Victor didn't deny a single accusation. Instead, he smiled. The smile that appeared on Victor Kane's face was unlike anything Emily had seen before. It wasn't the confident smile of a businessman defending his reputation, nor the nervous smile of someone caught in a lie. It was calm, almost amused, as though he had expected this moment long before anyone else in the room realized it had arrived. On the recording, the younger Jack looked from Michael to Victor, clearly sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. Michael kept one hand resting firmly on the ledger, while the other slowly opened it to a page marked with several colored tabs. "I checked every transfer," Michael said, his voice steady, despite the tension growing around the table. The donations never reached the housing project. They were divided across companies that exist only on paper, then redirected through accounts controlled by people connected to you. Victor remained standing. He didn't argue. He didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, he folded his hands in front of him and asked a question that sent a chill through everyone watching the tape. "How many people know what you've found?" Michael answered without hesitation. "Everyone in this room will know in about 30 seconds." Victor slowly looked around the table. The camera captured every face. Men who had spent years riding together now stared at one another in complete confusion, trying to understand how a routine meeting had suddenly become something else entirely. Then Victor laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It sounded almost sympathetic. "You always were an honest man, Michael." Michael's expression never changed. "And you always underestimated honest men." Victor nodded slowly, almost admiring the answer. "I suppose I did." For several seconds, no one spoke. Then, Victor reached into the briefcase again. Every rider inside the bus instinctively leaned forward, as though they could somehow change what had happened 3 decades earlier. Instead of pulling out another folder, Victor removed a small envelope and placed it gently on the table. "There are $200,000 in the account connected to this authorization letter," he said calmly. "Enough to change every life in this room." Daniel's face tightened. "I remember this." Richard looked toward him. "You never told us." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I forgot." Jack shook his head. "No." His voice carried a quiet sadness. "You didn't forget. You buried it." Daniel closed his eyes. He realized Jack was right. The years after the fire had shattered their memories into disconnected fragments. They remembered the flames, the funerals, and the grief. But ordinary conversations had disappeared beneath the weight of tragedy. On the screen, Victor gently slid the envelope toward Michael. "No one outside this room needs to know about accounting errors." Michael didn't touch it. Victor continued speaking, as though discussing nothing more serious than a delayed construction project. "You can keep your charity rides. You can keep your organization. You can even keep your reputation." He paused. "Walk away today and nobody gets hurt." The words echoed inside the old bus. Emily instinctively looked toward Jack. She already knew the answer. So did every brother standing behind him. Michael slowly picked up the envelope. For a brief moment, Victor's smile widened. Then Michael calmly tore the authorization letter in half. The pieces drifted onto the table. Victor's smile disappeared. "I thought you'd do that," he said quietly. Michael looked directly into his eyes. "You never understood why we built Iron Brotherhood." Victor replied without hesitation. "No, I understood perfectly." His voice became colder. "That's why I knew exactly how to destroy it." Every man inside the bus froze. Emily felt her breathing become shallow. Jack's fists tightened so hard that his knuckles turned white. On the recording, Victor slowly closed the briefcase before taking one step backward. "By tomorrow," he said calmly, "everyone will believe your own brothers betrayed you." Michael frowned. "What are you talking about?" Victor's expression never changed. When trust disappears, he looked around the room. Families destroy themselves. Jack suddenly whispered under his breath, "No." The younger Jack on the screen stood up from his chair. "What did you do?" Victor looked directly at him. "I simply gave people what they already wanted." He smiled again. "Someone to blame." Emily felt every hair on her arms stand up. For 30 years, Jack had lived with crushing guilt, convinced that he had failed his brothers. Countless friendships had quietly dissolved because every survivor wondered whether someone else had leaked information about the meeting. Suspicion had spread through Iron Brotherhood, exactly as Victor intended. He hadn't needed to destroy them himself. He had allowed grief to do the work. Michael seemed to understand the same thing at that exact moment. His face changed. He quickly gathered the ledgers from the table and looked toward Jack. "You have to leave." Jack shook his head immediately. "We all leave." Michael's voice became sharper. "Jack?" Everyone in the room looked toward him. You have to take these records. Jack refused. We leave together. Michael stepped closer until the two friends stood face to face. If they came for these documents, he held up the ledger, then they'll come through that door any minute. Jack grabbed Michael's arm. Then we fight together. Michael smiled sadly. You still don't get it. His voice softened. You were never the one I was trying to save. Jack frowned. What do you mean? Michael looked around the room at every brother gathered there. I've always been trying to save this family. Those words hung in the air like a final farewell. Inside the bus, not a single man moved, not because they already knew what would happen next, but because every one of them finally understood why Michael had gone back into the burning building. It had never been a reckless act. It had been the final decision of a man determined that the truth would survive, even if he did not. At that exact moment, the recording suddenly shook violently. A loud explosion echoed somewhere beyond the meeting room. The lights flickered. Someone shouted. Then the camera went dark for nearly 5 seconds before the image returned. Smoke was already pouring beneath the meeting room door. Jack's breathing stopped. He knew exactly what came next. This wasn't the beginning of the fire. It was the beginning of the betrayal becoming irreversible. Smoke began spilling beneath the meeting room door long before anyone inside understood where it was coming from. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a thin gray ribbon creeping across the concrete floor. But within seconds, it thickened into a dense cloud that swallowed the far corner of the room. The riders on the recording instinctively stood from their chairs, while the men watching inside the old bus remained frozen, witnessing the exact moment that had haunted their lives for 3 decades. The younger Jack was the first to react. He rushed toward the door, but before his hand reached the handle, Victor Kane stepped directly into his path. "Move," Jack demanded. Victor didn't. Instead, he looked at Jack with a calmness so unnatural that it sent a chill through everyone watching. "You still don't understand," Victor said. "The fire isn't for you." Jack shoved him aside with enough force to send him stumbling into the conference table. Papers scattered across the floor as Jack pulled the door open. A wall of smoke rushed into the room. Someone outside was shouting. Another voice screamed for help. Then came the unmistakable sound of motorcycles crashing onto concrete. Emily instinctively covered her mouth. She had imagined the fire countless times while piecing together the story, but nothing prepared her for the panic unfolding on the screen. Men who had spent years facing danger together suddenly found themselves trapped inside their own headquarters, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack disappeared into the smoke without hesitation. Michael immediately grabbed the ledgers from the table and forced them into Victor's fireproof briefcase before thrusting it back into Jack's hands the moment he reappeared. "Take it." Jack pushed it away. "We don't leave without everyone." Michael seized Jack by both shoulders. "Listen to me." Even through the distorted audio, the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. "If those records disappear." He pointed toward the briefcase. "Everything we've built disappears with them." Jack stared at him, refusing to move. For years he had led these men by never leaving anyone behind. Every instinct inside him rejected what Michael was asking. "I'm not abandoning you." Michael's expression softened. "I know." For one heartbreaking moment, neither man spoke. Around them, smoke continued filling the room, while several brothers helped others toward the exits. The recording captured confusion, fear, and desperate determination. Yet amid the chaos, Michael looked strangely calm, as though he had already accepted a decision no one else was willing to face. He placed one hand against Jack's chest. "You're not leaving because you're more important." Jack's eyes locked onto his friend's. "You're leaving because someone has to tell the truth." Jack shook his head violently. "We'll tell it together." Michael smiled with heartbreaking gentleness. "I wish we could." Then another explosion shook the building. The ceiling trembled. A support beam crashed somewhere outside the room. Victor, who had been lying on the floor after Jack shoved him aside, suddenly pushed himself upright and moved toward the doorway. Daniel's voice broke inside the bus. "There." Emily looked at him. What Daniel pointed at the television. "Watch Victor." For the first time, Emily took her eyes off Jack and Michael. Victor wasn't trying to escape. He was moving toward the electrical control panel mounted beside the meeting room entrance. His hand disappeared behind the smoke for only a second. Then the emergency lights throughout the room went dark. The image on the videotape flickered violently before switching to the camera's weak backup battery. Jack's face hardened. He cut the power. Richard's breathing grew heavier. He wanted everyone trapped. The grainy recording continued. In the darkness, only scattered emergency lights illuminated the room. The reduced visibility made the smoke even more suffocating. Michael looked toward the doorway, then back at Jack. "You have 10 seconds. Jack refused to move. Michael suddenly did something none of the brothers watching had remembered. He struck Jack. Not with anger, not to hurt him. A single hard punch to the side of his head. Jack stumbled backward in complete shock. Before he could recover, Michael shoved the fireproof briefcase into Ben's arms. "Get him out." Ben looked horrified. "I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice." Michael's voice echoed across the room with an authority none of them had ever heard before. For the first time in Iron Brotherhood's history, Michael Reed gave an order instead of a suggestion. Daniel lowered his head inside the bus. "I remember." His voice trembled. "I remember dragging Jack." Ben closed his eyes. I thought he was unconscious because of the smoke. Jack stared silently at the screen. "No." His voice broke. "He knocked me out." Every memory he had carried for 30 years suddenly rearranged itself. He had spent decades believing he had failed to save Michael. The truth was infinitely more painful. Michael had made the decision for him. On the recording, Ben and 2 other riders forced Jack toward the exit, despite his desperate attempts to break free. Michael remained behind, not because he couldn't leave, because he chose not to. He turned one final time toward Victor Kane. Victor had reached the far end of the room and was trying to retrieve something from beneath a collapsed cabinet. Michael saw it. His expression changed instantly. Without a moment's hesitation, he ran straight toward Victor. Emily frowned. What was he doing? Nobody answered. The camera angle couldn't show what Victor was reaching for. Only Michael seemed to know. He tackled Victor just as another violent explosion tore through the building. The image erupted into violent static. The camera shook wildly before crashing sideways onto the floor. For several endless seconds, all the recording captured was smoke, falling, debris, and distant voices shouting through the chaos. Then, through the haze, one final image appeared. Victor Kane crawled across the concrete floor. He wasn't injured badly enough to stop moving. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He was dragging a black metal briefcase toward the exit. Michael, bleeding heavily and barely able to stand, reached out and grabbed Victor's ankle. Victor turned. Their lips moved. The damaged microphone couldn't capture every word, but one sentence came through with chilling clarity. Victor looked down at Michael Reed and quietly said, "You should have taken the money." The next instant, a burning support beam collapsed between them. The screen exploded into white static. Then the recording ended. Inside the old bus, no one spoke. No one cried. The silence itself became grief. After 30 years, they had finally witnessed the last moments of the man who had given everything to protect them. And for Jack Sullivan, the greatest wound was no longer believing Michael had died because of him. It was realizing that Michael had looked directly into the face of the man responsible. He spent his final strength making sure that man could never escape with the truth. No one inside the old bus moved after the screen dissolved into static. The faint hiss coming from the television seemed impossibly loud, filling the silence left behind by Michael Reed's final moments. Jack remained standing where he was, his eyes fixed on the blank screen, unable to convince himself that the recording had truly ended. For 30 years he had imagined 1,000 different versions of that night, and every one of them ended with the same unbearable conclusion, that he had failed the man who trusted him most. Now, after watching the truth unfold with his own eyes, he realized something even harder to accept. Michael had never blamed him. Michael had spent his final moments protecting him. Jack slowly reached forward and pressed the stop button. The machine clicked softly, and the room fell completely silent. He removed the cassette with extraordinary care before placing it back inside the metal lockbox, almost as though he were returning Michael's voice to a place where nothing else could harm it. Emily looked around the bus. None of the men were trying to hide their emotions anymore. Daniel sat with both elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor without blinking. Richard had quietly removed his glasses, wiping away tears that continued returning no matter how many times he brushed them aside. Walter stood beside the window, his shoulders trembling ever so slightly as he looked toward the junkyard where he and Michael had spent so many weekends building motorcycles for charity rides. For years they had remembered Michael as the brother who died in a fire. Now they remembered him as the man who had uncovered the truth, refused a fortune to stay silent, and knowingly sacrificed his own life to ensure the evidence survived. Jack finally broke the silence. I have hated myself for 30 years. His voice was calm, but every word carried the exhaustion of a man who had carried the same punishment longer than anyone should. I kept asking why Michael went back into that building. He lowered his eyes toward the pocket watch resting beside the television. I thought he was trying to save me. Daniel slowly shook his head. He already had. Jack closed his eyes. No. A faint smile appeared through the tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. He was saving all of us. No one disagreed. Michael hadn't gone back into the flames because he believed he could survive. He had gone back because he understood something the others did not. If Victor Kane escaped with the records hidden inside that briefcase, Iron Brotherhood would forever be remembered as another failed organization destroyed by corruption. The charity rides the hospitals they had funded, the families they had helped, the veterans they had buried with honor. Every act of kindness would eventually disappear beneath rumors and suspicion. Michael had refused to let that happen. Then quietly stood and carried the lockbox back onto the table. He opened it once more, carefully lifting out the financial ledgers, the photographs, the contracts, and finally, the sealed envelope addressed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have enough now, he said softly. Emily looked at him. Enough for what? Ben met Jack's eyes before answering. To finish what Michael started. Jack remained silent. For the first time since the brothers had reunited, every decision rested with him again. 30 years earlier, they would have followed him without question. This time, however, no one spoke because they wanted something different. They wanted Jack himself to decide whether he was ready to stop hiding from the world. Emily watched him carefully. The old man who had spent decades avoiding every conversation about his past seemed to disappear before her eyes. His back straightened almost imperceptibly. The uncertainty that had clouded his expression since she first met him slowly gave way to something steadier. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was purpose. Jack picked up the envelope addressed to the FBI and turned it over in his hands. Michael wanted this delivered. Daniel nodded. He trusted the law. Jack looked toward the television. He also knew the wrong people were protecting Victor. Emily immediately understood his concern. 30 years have passed, she said. The people who buried this case may not even be in office anymore. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe. He looked around at the brothers gathered inside the bus. But I'm not gambling Michael's life on maybe. Richard leaned forward. What are you thinking? Jack carefully returned the envelope to the lockbox before answering. "We don't take this to the county." Everyone understood why. Victor's influence reached too deeply into local government. "We don't even take it to the state." Then slowly nodded. "Straight to federal investigators." Jack met his gaze. In person. Emily's heart began beating faster. "You mean after everything is authenticated?" Jack shook his head. "No." He looked directly at her. "I mean, today." The room fell quiet again. Walter was the first to smile. "That's the Jack I remember." A gentle ripple of laughter spread through the bus, breaking the heaviness that had settled over them since the recording ended. Jack couldn't help smiling back. "I've wasted enough years." He looked toward the Harley sitting beneath its familiar canvas outside the window. "Michael asked me not to disappear." His voice grew stronger with every word. "I ignored him for 30 years. He paused. "I'm done ignoring him." Before anyone could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the moment. Every rider inside the bus instinctively turned toward the window. 3 sheriff's vehicles burst through the broken gate, followed by Victor Kane's black SUV. Uniformed deputies climbed out almost immediately, spreading across the junkyard with urgent expressions, while several county officials hurried behind them. Emily frowned. "That's too many officers." Daniel looked through the window. "They're not here to negotiate." Victor stepped forward, holding several papers in one hand while pointing toward the old bus with the other. His voice echoed across the junkyard. "Jack Sullivan." The old biker calmly opened the bus door and stepped outside. Nearly 700 riders who had quietly continued arriving throughout the morning turned simultaneously toward him. For the first time, Victor Kane truly saw them all. Rows upon rows of motorcycles stretched far beyond the junkyard fence lining both sides of the road until they disappeared into the distance. Men and women from every corner of the country stood silently beside their bikes, each wearing the same silver wolf that Victor had spent 30 years trying to erase. The confident smile vanished from his face. He hadn't expected dozens of brothers. He hadn't expected hundreds. He certainly hadn't expected an entire brotherhood. Jack walked slowly toward the center of the yard until he stood facing Victor, with every rider behind him. Victor unfolded the papers in his hand, attempting to recover his composure. "Jack Sullivan, by authority of the county. You should stop." Jack's calm voice interrupted him. Victor frowned. "You don't have the authority to interrupt legal proceedings." Jack looked at him with a quiet certainty Emily had never seen before. "No." He reached into his leather vest and slowly removed the sealed envelope bearing the words, "Evidence to be delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but I do have the authority." He held the envelope where Victor could see it clearly. "To end 30 years of lies." For the first time since the fire that destroyed Iron Brotherhood, Victor Kane's face revealed something he had managed to hide from everyone else. Fear. Real fear. And every brother standing behind Jack understood exactly why. Some people spend their entire lives chasing wealth, status, or recognition, believing those things define who they are. But Jack Sullivan's story reminds us that the greatest legacy a person can leave behind isn't measured by money or fame. It's measured by the lives they choose to lift, the promises they refuse to break, and the people who still stand beside them long after the world has forgotten their name. Before you judge someone by where they are today, remember that you may know only the last page of a story that began decades before you arrived. The quiet man everyone ignored carried the respect of hundreds. The homeless biker people laughed at had built a brotherhood stronger than time itself. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never feel the need to tell the world who they used to be. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories of courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and hope to viewers around the world. Most importantly, we'd love to hear from you. What part of Jack Sullivan's journey affected you the most? And if you had been one of those riders, would you have kept the same promise for 30 years? If you find this story meaningful, please comment with the number 1. We read every one of them. Until next time, remember this. Never underestimate a quiet soul. Never mock a stranger whose story you don't know. And never forget that one act of loyalty can outlive an entire lifetime. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. Take care of the people you love, and we'll see you in the next story.